Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Case 1. It was late at night on August 30th, 2003 in Las Cruces, New Mexico. A 22-year-old college student named Katie Sepik had just left a party. She was upset, walking home alone, and didn't have her keys. By the next morning, she had disappeared. Her phone and purse were found, even her shoes, but Katie was nowhere to be seen. At first, no one could imagine what had happened, but the truth that would come out in the weeks and months that followed shocked everyone, her family, her friends, and the entire community. This is Katie's story. Katie Sepik came into the world on December 26, 1980, in the quiet town of Carlsbad, New Mexico. She was the firstborn of Dave and Jean Sepik, growing up alongside her younger siblings, AJ and Carolyn. From early on, Katie stood out, not just as the eldest, but as someone with a strong presence. She had a natural ability to take charge, yet never lost sight of being warm and protective toward the people she loved. To her brother AJ, Katie was more than a sister. She was a confidant and a guardian. Beneath her commanding nature was a vibrant sense of humor. Friends often described her as the kind of person who could make you laugh until your stomach hurt, even if the joke was on her. She was quick-witted and self-deprecating, able to turn any awkward moment into something charming and funny. People were drawn to Katie. Her confidence, her charm, and her genuine spirit made her well-loved wherever she went. Katie was studying business administration at New Mexico State University, and it was a field that suited her perfectly. Smart, calm under pressure, and driven, she had all the qualities of a future leader. She lived in an apartment on the east side of Las Cruces, conveniently close to campus. To help with expenses, she also worked part-time at a buzzing Mexican restaurant that was popular with locals and students alike. Though she was steadily working toward her degree, Katie wasn't entirely sure what came next. Her mother, Jayan, once said Katie dreamed big. She wanted to leave her mark on the world, to make a real difference. She didn't have a clear path yet, but she knew she was meant for something extraordinary. At the time, Katie was in a relationship with Joe Bischoff, a fellow student studying biochemistry. The two were inseparable, deeply in love, and full of plans for the future. Joe even gave her a diamond ring, a promise for the life they envisioned together after graduation. After earning her bachelor's degree, Katie was planning to continue with a master's program, while Joe returned to his hometown of Gallup for a new job. They weren't broken up, just taking different steps forward in their lives, still committed, still making time for each other whenever possible. But the future Katie had envisioned never came. On the night of August 30th, 2003, during Labor Day weekend, Katie, Joe, and her roommate Tracy attended a college party in a neighborhood not far from Katie's apartment. The plan was simple: enjoy the night and crash at the house afterward. But by morning, things had taken a terrifying turn. Tracy woke up to find Katie gone. Her purse, keys, and phone were all still at the house. Joe was there, but Katie had vanished. The two friends began calling everyone they could think of. When no one had seen her, they contacted Katie's parents, who were just as confused and concerned. By August 31st, Katie was officially reported missing. That same day, a horrifying discovery was made. Local residents passing near an old landfill site in Las Cruces stumbled upon something in the dirt, what appeared to be a woman's body. Police were called immediately. The scene was gruesome. The woman had clearly endured a violent assault. Her clothes had been removed, and she bore injuries that suggested she fought hard to defend herself. There were burns on the body, hinting that the attacker may have tried to set her on fire. Detectives also found fresh tire tracks nearby, suggesting that the body had been transported and left there after the crime took place elsewhere. Although her identity hadn't yet been confirmed, the recent missing persons report gave detectives a strong suspicion. Katie's father, Dave, was brought in to identify the body, and to his heartbreak, it was Katie. Investigators turned their attention to the people closest to her, starting with Joe and Tracy. Joe explained that they'd been at the party together, but at some point, Katie disappeared. He assumed she had simply gone home early. Only the next morning, when she didn't show up or respond, did he realize something was wrong. Meanwhile, another team of officers checked out Katie's apartment. What they found raised even more questions. Just below her bedroom window, a pair of women's shoes lay haphazardly discarded. They were Katie's. Looking up, detectives saw that the window screen had been removed and tossed aside. Nothing appeared to be broken, but it was clear someone had tried to get in or out. This led them to a possible scenario. Katie may have returned home from the party, realized she didn't have her keys, and decided to climb through her bedroom window to get inside. But whatever happened after that remains unclear. At first, it seemed like Katie Sapich had simply gone home from the party, exhausted and not wanting to walk back later to grab her things. That's what her friends assumed, anyway. But while they believed she was safe at home, investigators were piecing together a much darker possibility, one where Katie was attacked after returning to her apartment. But by whom? Was it a random predator, or did someone close to her have something to do with it? And most puzzling of all, why did Katie suddenly leave the party? Detectives circled back to question her friends once more, hoping to close some of the gaps in their timeline. That's when they discovered the reason Katie left. She had caught Joe, her boyfriend, kissing another girl at the party. Katie had stormed off, hurt and furious. This discovery put a new spotlight on Joe, not just because of the betrayal, but because he hadn't mentioned any of it during his initial interviews. When he was first questioned, Joe claimed to have no idea why Katie left. Now it seemed he had been keeping a crucial part of the story to himself. Understandably, this raised serious red flags. Joe later admitted that Katie was upset with him and left the party because of what she saw. He added that he drove past her house afterward to check on her, and even tried calling her the next morning. But this only deepened the investigators' suspicions, because Joe knew Katie had left her phone behind at the party. Why would he call a phone he knew she couldn't answer? To the detectives, it seemed like Joe might be trying to craft a narrative, and they began considering the possibility that he was involved in Katie's death. But they needed proof, and that meant DNA. Katie's attacker had left behind biological evidence, including skin under her fingernails, and DNA was also found on her body. This was the early 2000s, so DNA testing was possible, though not as advanced as today. Still, it was enough to rule suspects in or out. But when investigators asked Joe to submit a DNA sample, he flat out refused. That refusal sent shockwaves through the investigation. Katie's loved ones were devastated. Joe had been a part of their lives, someone they believed their daughter loved deeply. Now he was being uncooperative during the most crucial time. To Katie's family, it felt like betrayal on top of tragedy. Police were stuck. Their strongest lead was now stonewalling them. Without a DNA sample, they had no way to directly link or eliminate Joe as the suspect. In the meantime, they interviewed and tested every man who'd been close to Katie. But time after time, the DNA came back with no match. Joe remained under quiet surveillance, but he didn't do anything that screamed guilt. It left detectives frustrated and confused. Months passed. Then came a break. Investigators learned that Katie and Joe had been intimate on the night of the party. This led them to collect and test the bedding in Katie's apartment. Male DNA was found, presumably Joe's, but when it was compared to the DNA from the crime scene, there was no match. That was a huge moment. If the DNA on the bed belonged to Joe, then the DNA on Katie's body came from someone else. But to be certain, and to officially clear him, they needed Joe's DNA to compare directly. This time, Joe agreed. He finally submitted a sample, and when the results came back, it was confirmed. He wasn't the killer. Joe later explained his hesitation. He feared that since he and Katie had been physically close that night, his DNA might be misinterpreted and used against him. While his fear might have been valid, his silence cost the investigation valuable time. 3 whole months, in fact, during which Katie's case stalled. With Joe ruled out, detectives had to start over. Now, the working theory was that Katie's killer was a stranger. Using the DNA collected at the scene, investigators were able to extract a partial ethnic profile. It suggested the suspect was a Hispanic male, and the tire tracks near Katie's body? They were believed to come from a pickup truck. A Hispanic man, possibly driving a pickup. That was all they had to go on. Leads came and went. Every known offender in the region was investigated. Katie's parents even offered a $100,000 reward for information that could help solve the case. But nothing came up. Nothing stuck. The momentum of the investigation began to fade, and the weight of silence grew heavier for Katie's family. Katie's mother refused to let her daughter become another cold case. She fought hard to keep Katie's story alive, speaking out and pushing for answers. Still, days turned into weeks, then into years. Then, in December of 2006, a breakthrough came. A DNA match had finally been found. The DNA belonged to a 27-year-old man named Gabriel Avila. At the time of the match, Avila was already serving time in prison for aggravated burglary and assault. That conviction, committed just 3 months after Katie's murder, is what led to his DNA being uploaded to the system. In that case, Gabriel had broken into a home while armed with a knife, planning to rob and potentially harm the woman living there. What he didn't expect was that the woman had a roommate. Spooked by the unexpected presence, Avila fled the scene. He was arrested shortly after, but was released on bond, and then vanished. For over a year, Gabriel remained in hiding. Eventually, authorities tracked him down, and he was convicted for the 2003 burglary attempt. He was sentenced to 9 years behind bars. Now, thanks to that conviction, police had a name tied to the DNA that had haunted them for years. Investigators immediately began building a case, digging into Gabriel Avila's background. They found out he had once been married, and they decided to speak with his ex-wife to learn more. That interview brought a chilling revelation. Back in 2003, Gabriel owned a pickup truck, the same type of vehicle suspected of being used to dump Katie's body. But what truly blew the case wide open was what Gabriel's ex-wife discovered in the truck's cup holder years earlier. A diamond ring. It wasn't just any ring. It was the same one Joe had given to Katie, a piece of jewelry she wore every single day. Her parents had even mentioned its absence when her body was found. For some reason, Gabriel had kept the ring. His ex-wife, believing he was cheating, had hung onto it as proof. What she didn't realize was that this ring would become the key piece of evidence linking Gabriel directly to Katie's murder. 3 years later, she still had the ring. She handed it over to detectives, who now had a physical item stolen from Katie, one that had stayed in the killer's possession all this time. With this new evidence, police headed to the prison to confront Gabriel. At first, he denied everything. He claimed not to know Katie. But the moment they placed the ring in front of him, his entire demeanor shifted. The facade crumbled. Gabriel Avila confessed. He told investigators he had never met Katie before that night. He had been driving around Las Cruces in his pickup truck when he nearly hit a young woman walking along the road. Katie. He offered her a ride home, but she declined and kept walking. That should have been the end of it. But instead, something dark inside Gabriel took over. He followed her. Katie had forgotten her keys and was trying to get back into her apartment by climbing through her bedroom window. That's when Gabriel attacked. He crept up behind her and dragged her to the ground. Katie fought back with everything she had, even scratching him in the struggle. But he was stronger. He overpowered her, sexually assaulted her, and then took her life. When asked why he didn't walk away after the assault, Gabriel said he was afraid Katie would report him. Afterward, he loaded Katie's body into his truck and drove to the landfill, where he tried to destroy all evidence by setting the scene on fire. But the fire didn't burn long enough or hot enough. Whether it was the wind or insufficient fuel, the flames died out and left behind the very evidence that would one day catch him. In December 2006, Gabriel Avila was officially charged with the assault and murder of Katie Sepich. He pled guilty. The court sentenced him to 69 years in prison, on top of the 9 years he was already serving. For Katie's loved ones, the news brought a mixture of relief and heartache. The person responsible was finally behind bars, but it had taken 3 agonizing years. And during that time, he had attempted another violent crime. Her family wasn't content to let that be the end of it. They turned their grief into action. Katie's parents began pushing for change. They advocated for legislation that would ensure that DNA is collected at the time of arrest for violent crimes, not after conviction. Their efforts led to the creation of the Katie Sepich Enhanced DNA Collection Act of 2010, better known as Katie's Law. This legislation aimed to empower law enforcement by using DNA technology earlier in the process. It allowed DNA to be collected from individuals arrested for serious crimes like murder, assault, abduction, and stalking. The goal was clear: catch dangerous individuals before they could harm anyone else. In a way, Katie did change the world, just not in the way anyone could have imagined. Her story inspired a national movement and helped bring about a powerful legal tool that continues to bring justice to families across the country. Katie's absence is felt deeply by those who loved her. Her smile, her spark, and her dreams live on in their hearts. And while no sentence could ever erase their pain, the Sepich family finds comfort in knowing that their daughter's legacy is protecting others and that she will never be forgotten. Katie had her entire life ahead of her, one filled with potential, ambition, and love. But in a single moment, a complete stranger took that all away. What remains is a story that is both heartbreaking and inspiring. A story of unimaginable loss, relentless pursuit of justice, and a family that refused to let their daughter's light be extinguished. Case 2. It was a normal Saturday morning in Bethesda, Maryland, when the manager of a Lululemon store showed up to open for the day. But the moment she walked inside, she knew something was wrong. The store was a mess, clothes everywhere, mannequins knocked over, and the floor had blood on it. As she stood there in shock, she heard something, a soft moan coming from the back. What she found next would leave everyone speechless. 2 employees had been inside the store the night before. Now one of them was dead, and the other was tied up and hurt. At first, it seemed like a terrible robbery gone wrong. But as police started asking questions, the story began to change. And what really happened that night was far worse than anyone imagined. Jana Murray entered the world on November 22, 1980, in Wichita, Kansas. She was the daughter of David and Phyllis Rosalind Murray. From a young age, Jana stood out for her adventurous spirit. She had a deep love for animals and dancing, and giving back was part of who she was. She spent much of her life volunteering. Her friends and family often described her as someone whose smile could light up any room. Jana also had an undeniable passion for travel. Her goal was to set foot on every continent, and she managed to visit all of them except Antarctica. For her 30th birthday, she marked the occasion by filming herself bungee jumping, perfectly capturing her thrill-seeking nature. Academically, Jana was a star. Her hard work earned her a scholarship that took her to Madrid, where she spent 2 years studying at St. Louis University. She later completed her Bachelor of Science degree at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. But Jana didn't stop there. She pushed forward and eventually earned dual master's degrees in communication and business administration from Johns Hopkins University. For her master's thesis, she focused on Lululemon Athletica, a premium yoga and fitness apparel brand. Naturally, she pursued a position with the company after graduating, and her drive and business instincts quickly landed her a role. By 2011, Jana was a team leader at the Lululemon store in Bethesda, Maryland. She was also close to finishing her second master's degree. Outside of work and school, Jana was in a happy relationship with her longtime boyfriend, Fraser Bosel. What she didn't know was that Fraser had begun researching engagement rings. He was preparing to propose. Life was falling into place beautifully for Jana. Her career was thriving, her education nearly complete, and her relationship was stronger than ever. A bright future was just around the corner. But everything changed on March 11, 2011. Jana's promising journey was suddenly cut short by a tragic and unimaginable event. The next morning, on March 12th, Rachel, the manager of the Lululemon store, arrived at the Bethesda location shortly before 8 a.m. to open up. Bethesda was generally considered a quiet, safe area, but when Rachel reached the entrance, she noticed the door wasn't locked. That was her first sign something was off. As she stepped inside, it was immediately clear that something terrible had happened. The store was in disarray. Mannequins were knocked over, clothes were scattered, and more horrifyingly, blood was splattered across the floors, walls, and ceiling. Still trying to make sense of the chaos, Rachel suddenly heard faint moaning. Someone was still inside and in pain. Overwhelmed with panic and fear, she ran out of the store and straight to the neighboring Apple store, where a long line of customers had gathered for the release of the new iPad 2. Among the crowd, one man named Ryan couldn't help but notice how distressed Rachel appeared as she stood outside the Lululemon store. When she explained something was terribly wrong inside, Ryan offered to go in with her and check it out. Inside, Ryan walked toward the back of the store, moving past the chaos. Bloody footprints marked the floor, and the space looked like a disaster zone. As he neared the office area, he stumbled upon something unimaginable. A woman with long blonde hair was lying face down in a pool of blood. Before he could fully process the horror, a soft moan caught his attention. It was coming from the bathroom. Inside, he found another woman, her hands and ankles bound with zip ties, her body bloodied but still alive. It was clear she was injured and in pain, but miraculously she was breathing. Ryan rushed back to the front of the store and told Rachel to call 911 immediately. First responders arrived quickly and were faced with a gruesome scene. They began the task of identifying the two women. Tragically, the deceased was 30-year-old Jana Murray. The survivor, badly hurt but alive, was identified as Brittany Norwood, a 28-year-old employee who had transferred from a Lululemon store in Georgetown just 6 weeks earlier. Brittany's injuries were extensive. Cuts and bruises covered her legs, arms, chest, face, and torso. Zip ties still restrained her, and both women's pants had been slashed, raising disturbing concerns that the attackers may have assaulted them. Brittany was rushed to the local hospital, visibly shaken and in need of immediate care. Back at the store, investigators began examining the body of Jana Murray. The violence inflicted on her defied belief. Medical examiners would later find 331 wounds on her body, over half of which were concentrated on her chest and face. She had been attacked with at least 6 different tools found scattered throughout the store, most of them likely taken from a store toolbox, items including a hammer, a box cutter, a wrench, and a knife. Around her neck was a ligature, though it wasn't tight enough to suggest strangulation. Still, it was an odd and unsettling detail. Jana's body was transported for an autopsy, while her devastated parents and boyfriend were notified of her death. The autopsy revealed heartbreaking truths. Jana had fought with everything she had. Her body bore over 100 defensive wounds. Ultimately, the fatal blow had struck the back of her neck. There was evidence that she had tried to escape. The blood trail led toward the store's emergency exit. There was even blood on the door handle, along with a key still in the lock, Jana's key. The attack had lasted for roughly 20 minutes. The idea that Jana had endured such agony for so long was almost too much to bear. Detectives urgently needed answers, but they were met with challenges. The Lululemon store had no external security cameras, which meant they had no footage showing who might have entered or exited the store that night. That lack of surveillance was seen as a serious oversight. Investigators turned to the Apple Store's security footage across the street and discovered video from the night before that showed 2 men dressed in dark clothing walking near the store around the time the attack occurred. However, the footage was taken from too far away to make any definitive identification. With no other leads, detectives turned to the only person who might know the truth, Brittany Norwood. Though Brittany was still clearly traumatized, flinching and recoiling from any physical touch, she eventually shared her account of what had happened. According to Brittany, on the evening of March 11, 2011, she and Jana were on the closing shift. Jana had driven to work while Brittany took public transit. After locking up the store, they went their separate ways. But shortly after arriving at the metro station, Brittany realized she had left her metro card inside the store. She called another coworker to get Jana's number and then phoned her directly. Despite having nearly reached home, Jana turned back to help Brittany. It was just like her to go out of her way for someone else. At around 10:05 p.m., Jana unlocked the store door with Brittany right behind her. But the moment the door opened, 2 masked men in dark clothing pushed their way inside. One was tall, the other shorter. Both appeared to be white and in their 20s. She said the shorter man attacked her, while the taller one took hold of Jana. They forced the women to the back of the store, threatened them, and told Brittany they knew where she lived. She had utility bills in her purse with her address, along with her ID. Terrified, Brittany believed the men were robbers and hoped they would just take what they wanted and leave. But instead, she claimed the situation spiraled into violence. Both women were physically assaulted and taunted with racial slurs. Brittany said they were violated, and during the chaos, she could hear Jana screaming. Eventually, the screaming stopped. Brittany said that's when she knew Jana was gone. She feared she was next. But then, unexpectedly, the men told her they would spare her life. Why they chose to leave her alive, she didn't know. When Brittany was asked why the attacker spared her, her answer was chilling. They said she was fun to take advantage of. Once the brutal assault ended, the men allegedly tied Brittany up and left her inside one of the store's bathrooms. That's where she was later discovered. The interview was eventually cut short, so investigators could focus on gathering forensic evidence, hoping to find DNA that would lead them to the men responsible. Meanwhile, based on Brittany's account, authorities set up surveillance outside the Lululemon store. Not long after, they spotted 2 men dressed in black, matching Brittany's description, and stopped them for questioning. But this promising lead quickly unraveled. The men were waiters from a nearby restaurant, and they walked that same path every night after their shifts. The black clothing? Part of their work uniform. Digging into surveillance footage from previous nights, police confirmed that these 2 men regularly passed by the store at that same time, following the exact route. Both had rock-solid alibis for the night of the crime, and were cooperative with investigators. They willingly provided their DNA and shoe prints for comparison. Everything was sent for analysis, but it all came back clean. On March 16, 2011, 5 days after the incident, Brittany was brought in again for further questioning. When asked if she knew what kind of car Jana drove, she said she didn't. The interview wrapped up shortly after, but the next day a surprising twist. Brittany's siblings contacted the police and said she had something else to share. They explained that she was afraid to come forward on her own, fearful that the attackers might return and hurt her if she said too much. So, on March 18th, Brittany sat down with detectives for a third interview. This time, she admitted that she actually did know what Jana's car looked like because the attackers had made her move it. According to Brittany, the men forced her to drive Jana's car away from the store before they assaulted her. They told her she was being watched and threatened to kill her if she tried anything or didn't return right away. While moving the car, she noticed a police officer nearby, but didn't approach him, fearing for her life. Yet, despite this explanation, the police began to suspect that Brittany wasn't being fully honest. One major inconsistency involved her earlier claims that both she and Jana had been sexually assaulted. Their pants had been sliced, seemingly supporting that story. But 6 days into the investigation, forensic testing told a different tale. The results were shocking. There was no evidence of sexual assault. In fact, the only DNA present at the scene belonged to Jana and Brittany. No trace of any male DNA anywhere. Even the samples from the two waiters didn't match anything at the scene. Investigators turned their attention to another key detail: footprints. Strangely, all the prints were contained inside the store. If the attackers had entered from outside, there would likely have been some kind of trail leading in or out. But there was nothing. That left police with two possible explanations. Either the attackers swapped shoes inside the store, which made little sense, or the attacker never left, because they had never come in from outside. Even more suspicious, the smaller footprints found throughout the scene matched Brittany's shoes. The larger set belonged to a size 14 shoe. At first, this seemed like a potential clue pointing to an unidentified male assailant. But when they matched the print to store inventory, they found the shoes had come from Lululemon's own stockroom. They were store property. This raised a critical question. If two men had ambushed Jana and Brittany, why would they take the time to change into store-brand shoes during a violent crime? It just didn't add up. Meanwhile, employees at the Apple store next door told police something disturbing. Around 10:30 p.m. on the night of the attack, they had heard a loud argument coming from Lululemon. Several staff members, including a security guard named Ricardo, said they distinctly heard two women fighting, one of them pleading, "Talk to me. Please don't do this. What's going on?" The voices were followed by crashing sounds, what sounded like a struggle, and something heavy being dragged across the floor. But no one heard a man's voice. At one point, someone was heard whispering, "God, please help me." Tragically, no one at the Apple store called the police. They dismissed the commotion as a workplace disagreement, some internal drama. Little did they know that Jana was fighting for her life just a few feet away. With all these discoveries piling up, detectives were growing more and more suspicious of Brittany. As investigators dug deeper into Brittany's background, one particular detail kept popping up, and it was more troubling than they could have imagined. Brittany Norwood had a secret, and it followed her long before she ever stepped foot into the Lululemon store. In college, Brittany had a reputation. Friends, roommates, and even teammates began to notice things disappearing: money, clothes, makeup. When it happened often enough, people started to talk, and eventually her kleptomaniac tendencies caught up with her. Reports were filed, and as a result, Brittany lost her scholarship and was expelled from school. By 2007, Brittany had relocated to Maryland and started working at a hotel. She quickly rose to a managerial role, but history repeated itself. When coworkers discovered that Brittany had been stealing from them, she was fired. Despite her rocky past, Brittany still had ambitions. She dreamed of becoming a personal trainer and eventually opening her own fitness center. Her job at Lululemon wasn't meant to be permanent. It was supposed to be a stepping stone toward a bigger goal. Jana Murray and Brittany weren't particularly close. They worked side by side, were friendly enough, but there wasn't much beyond that. Nothing suggested there was bad blood between them. So what triggered the horrifying events of March 11, 2011? That evening, before the store closed, employees went through the standard procedure, a mandatory bag check designed to prevent internal theft. Jana was tasked with inspecting Brittany's bag, and what she found raised a red flag. A pair of Lululemon leggings with the tag still attached sat inside. Jana didn't confront Brittany directly, but she contacted their manager and reported the incident. The manager told Jana she would handle it in the morning. Somehow Brittany found out. Later that night, after the store had closed and the employees had gone home, Brittany contacted Jana. She claimed she had left her Metro card at the store and needed help retrieving it. Jaina, being the kind and helpful person she was, agreed to return. What happened next is believed to have been a confrontation. Brittany possibly begging Jaina not to report her, hoping to avoid yet another firing. But when Jaina stood firm, refusing to back down, the situation turned volatile. Investigators believe Brittany attacked Jaina with store tools, items like a wrench, a hammer, a box cutter. As Jaina fought desperately to escape, trying to reason with Brittany, the assault escalated to a level of unimaginable brutality. After taking Jaina's life, Brittany moved her car to a different location to buy time and cover her tracks. A witness later reported seeing Brittany in the vehicle, and nearly 90 minutes later, she was still sitting there, possibly formulating the story she would tell next. Brittany returned to the store, put on size 14 shoes found on site, and staged the scene to look like a robbery gone wrong. She trashed the space, took cash from the registers, and then inflicted minor injuries on herself before zip-tying her own wrists and ankles. She placed herself in the bathroom and waited until morning, when coworkers discovered the horrifying scene. All of it a chillingly calculated attempt to divert suspicion. Jaina lost her life over a pair of stolen leggings. On March 18, 2011, exactly 1 week after the crime, Brittany Norwood was arrested. Prosecutors faced a challenge. They had to prove that this wasn't a spontaneous act of violence, but a premeditated murder. If they succeeded, Brittany would receive life without parole. Her defense team, however, aimed for a lesser charge, second-degree murder, arguing that she had snapped in the heat of the moment. The trial began in October 2011. The lead prosecutor, John McCarthy, painted Brittany as a manipulative woman and a compulsive liar. He laid out overwhelming forensic evidence and highlighted the inconsistencies in her story to prove that Brittany had planned the attack. Meanwhile, the defense admitted Brittany had killed Jaina, but argued that it was not pre-planned. They said it was a tragic case of a young woman who panicked and lost control, but the details told a different story. Jaina didn't die quickly. She fought hard, left behind a trail of blood, tried to escape, and endured a 20-minute-long attack. She was conscious through most of it. That kind of prolonged violence made it clear this wasn't impulsive. It was deliberate. The jury didn't need long to reach a decision. After just an hour of deliberation, they found Brittany Norwood guilty of first-degree murder. In January 2012, Brittany was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge called the murder cold-blooded, premeditated, and merciless, and condemned the calculated steps Brittany took after the killing. He also criticized the Apple Store employees for their failure to act when they heard Jaina pleading for help, calling it an example of callous indifference. In 2015, Brittany's final appeal was denied. She remains imprisoned at the Maryland Correctional Institution for Women. This case will be remembered not only for its cruelty, but also for the heartbreaking irony. Jaina was murdered by someone she tried to help. All she did was tell the truth, and for that, she paid the ultimate price. Case 3. On a summer evening in July 2011, Laura Ackerson got into her car and drove toward Raleigh, North Carolina. She was going to pick up her kids from her ex, Grant Hayes. It was supposed to be a quick visit, just like many others before. But this time, Laura didn't come back. At first, her friends weren't too worried. Maybe she got delayed. Maybe her phone died. But when days went by with no word from her, they knew something was wrong. Behind the scenes, something terrible had already happened. Police would later find an apartment that smelled strongly of bleach. Items were missing. A strange letter appeared, and Grant and his new wife were suddenly on the move. So what really happened to Laura that night? And why did this loving mom, who only wanted to see her kids, end up at the center of such a dark and shocking mystery? This is the heartbreaking story of Laura Ackerson. Laura Ackerson entered the world on April 30th, 1984, born to Roger and Brenda Ackerson. From the start, Laura radiated joy, a bright, bubbly child with a warm and lively spirit. She spent her early years attending Grace Fellowship Church with her family, where she quickly became known for her sweet nature and gentle heart. While details about her early childhood remain scarce, everything changed for Laura in 1996. That year marked the collapse of what once seemed like a picture-perfect family. Her parents' constant fighting eventually led to divorce when Laura was just 12. The split hit her hard and left emotional scars that would linger. After the separation, Brenda took Laura and moved to Iowa. Laura later pursued graphic design at Kirkwood Community College, drawn by a natural flair for creativity. She had an instinct for art. Color, composition, and visual storytelling were second nature to her. Eventually, Laura relocated to Kingston, North Carolina, hoping for a fresh beginning. There, she attended a real estate school and found work in marketing and design. She also built a circle of close friends in nearby Raleigh. Having moved around so much growing up, Laura had never had a stable friend group. Finally, she felt like she belonged. In March 2007, while dining at a local restaurant, Laura met a man named Grant Hayes. Interestingly, they shared a birthday, April 30th, which sparked an immediate connection. Born in 1979 in Raleigh, Grant had a musical streak and a strong religious upbringing. He gained local recognition as a performer, playing small venues and bars, and had a magnetic personality that drew people in. Years before meeting Laura, Grant had married a woman named Emily Lovers, whom he'd fallen for soon after high school graduation. That relationship burned fast and bright, and then fizzled out. Their divorce left a deep mark on Grant, who had written love songs inspired by her. With the end of that marriage came a decline in his mental health. He was later diagnosed with bipolar disorder and depression, and prescribed powerful medications like lithium. But instead of sticking with treatment, Grant began self-medicating with alcohol and harder substances. As time passed, Grant's behavior grew more erratic. He dabbled in synthetic hallucinogens, which only amplified his worst traits: narcissism, paranoia, and aggression. He started having bizarre delusions, believing aliens controlled the government, and that he was a chosen one destined to survive the apocalypse by finding a spaceship. He even rejected modern medicine, including vaccines, convinced they were harmful. Despite his deteriorating mental state, Grant's music career was still afloat. He was booking regular gigs, and that's around the time Laura came into his life. To outsiders, Grant might have looked like a rising star, but behind closed doors, his relationship with Laura quickly became toxic. He was controlling, physically and emotionally abusive, and chronically unfaithful. Laura, already emotionally fragile from her childhood, struggled to break free. He isolated her from her friends and dictated nearly every part of her life, from her social circle to her daily routine. Shockingly, the couple tied the knot just months after meeting. Laura, longing for stability and love after years of emotional turmoil, believed she had found her fairy tale ending, but her friends were blindsided by the news. None of them even knew she was in a relationship, let alone married. Still, they stood by her, hoping she had made the right choice. Not long after Laura became pregnant, she was overjoyed, imagining a fresh chapter as a mother. Grant, on the other hand, wasn't thrilled. The news only intensified his possessiveness. When their son, Grant Jr., was born 9 months later, Laura poured every bit of love she had into him. Naming the baby after himself seemed like a classic move from Grant, not necessarily a sentimental one, but more a display of ego. Laura adored her son. Meanwhile, Grant was still chasing gigs, cheating, and indulging in drugs, showing little interest in fatherhood. Eventually, he was offered a job in the Virgin Islands. He took it without hesitation, leaving Laura and their newborn behind in North Carolina. Whether or not he was actually working out there is unclear, but one thing's for sure, he wasn't alone. Grant began seeing a woman named Amanda Perry Tucker, a single mother and aspiring actress. Amanda had scored small, uncredited roles in shows like The Sopranos and The Stepford Wives, but her career hadn't taken off. And that's where another chapter in this tangled story begins. Grant Hayes was instantly drawn to Amanda Perry Tucker, and not just because of her charm. Amanda had money, nearly $200,000 in cash and $80,000 worth of jewelry, possibly from her previous divorce, though that's never been confirmed. At the time Grant met her, he was flat broke, no savings, no stability. But Amanda had resources, and that changed everything for him. Their relationship picked up quickly. For Grant, being with Amanda was more than romance, it was leverage. He flaunted the affair, making no effort to hide it from Laura. In fact, he used it as a weapon, taunting and ridiculing her at every opportunity. But then Laura did something Grant never saw coming. She'd had enough. After years of enduring his manipulation, betrayal, and cruelty, Laura finally stood up and said she was leaving him for good. Surprisingly, even people close to Grant supported her decision. His own family, along with his ex-wife Emily, encouraged Laura to walk away, fully aware of how toxic Grant really was. But then came a twist. Laura discovered she was pregnant again. Despite everything Grant had put her through, she gave him yet another chance, though by now it was more like chance number 10. That decision spoke volumes about how deeply Laura loved her children. She was willing to endure emotional hardship just to try and keep her family intact, likely driven by the pain of her own parents' divorce. Trying to make things work, Laura packed up her life and moved to the Virgin Islands with her son Grant Jr., hoping proximity might help fix things. But Grant didn't see her arrival as a loving gesture. To him, it was an inconvenience. With Laura around, he couldn't keep living a double life under her nose. Eventually, Laura gave birth to her second son. Sadly, the baby faced serious health issues right from the start, and the family needed better access to medical care. So they relocated back to North Carolina. Grant was furious about the move. He blamed Laura and the kids for dragging him away from potential opportunities in the Virgin Islands. Meanwhile, Amanda remained in the picture, now living in New York, and urged Grant to explore opportunities in the entertainment industry there. But Grant didn't go to New York for work. He went to be with Amanda, and he loved it. He was finally close to her, away from his responsibilities, and immersed in a city full of distractions. Eventually, he reached out to Laura with a surprising request. He asked if he could take Grant Jr. for a diaper modeling photo shoot, promising he'd bring him right back. Laura hesitated, but agreed. She wanted her kids to know their father, despite everything. What she didn't know was that Grant had a completely different plan. When he didn't return their son as promised, Laura turned to Facebook for clues, and what she found shattered her. Grant had secretly married Amanda in New York and was now living with her. Along with Grant Jr., Laura was devastated. But the nightmare wasn't over. When she called to confront him, Grant dropped another bombshell, one that would flip her world upside down. According to him, their marriage had never been legal in the first place. Desperate for answers, Laura checked the marriage certificate, and there it was. Grant's signature was missing. Their union had never been legally binding. Then came the most gut-wrenching part. Grant and Amanda had filed for emergency custody of Grant Jr. and won. Because there was no formal custody agreement, and because Laura had no job or stable housing at the time, the court sided with Grant. He showed up to the hearings alone and claimed Laura was unfit. The court ruled in his favor, without ever hearing her side of the story. She went back to court and presented strong evidence showing Grant's abusive behavior and unstable mental health. Her determination forced the court to order psychological evaluations for both parents. In the meantime, Laura was allowed to speak with her sons daily and see them on weekends. But even then, Grant and Amanda, now pregnant with his child, found ways to make those moments unbearable. They interrupted phone calls, limited her access to the boys, and did everything possible to keep Laura at a distance. Still, Laura held on. And then came the psych evaluation. Grant failed it badly. The report noted that he had no real connection with his kids. The children were more comfortable, more at ease, and visibly happier with Laura. She, on the other hand, was described as a devoted and nurturing mother. Someone who put her children first, no matter the cost. The court took this seriously and ordered a more in-depth evaluation of Grant. Around the same time, Amanda gave birth to a baby girl, Lillian, on June 9, 2011. Following an intense custody battle, the court ruled in favor of a rotating 3-2 schedule between Laura and Grant, alternating 3 days with one parent, then 2 with the other. But by this point, Grant was barely holding himself together, his temper was worsening, and it was clear something was boiling beneath the surface. Then came the moment everything fell apart. On July 13, 2011, Laura had plans to meet her close friend and business partner, Chavin, later that evening. But she never showed up, and she never called. At first, Chavin didn't panic. Laura had mentioned earlier she needed to stop by Grant's place to pick up her boys. Her last known communication was a text she sent to Grant, letting him know she was on her way. He never replied. Days passed with no word, no calls, no texts, nothing. By July 18th, after 5 days of total silence, 27-year-old Laura Ackerson was officially reported missing by loved ones. Police acted fast. They searched her apartment, which looked completely normal. No sign of a struggle, nothing out of place. Surveillance footage showed her leaving the building, but never coming back. Their next stop was Grant and Amanda's apartment. Officers arrived with a search warrant and immediately sensed something was off. The couple wasn't home, but what was inside the apartment raised every red flag imaginable. The scent of bleach hit them like a wall. The space had been scrubbed top to bottom, suspiciously spotless. A few things were conspicuously missing. A shower curtain, a vacuum cleaner, several rugs. Patches on the floor were discolored, clearly scrubbed with harsh chemicals. But what really rattled investigators were two pieces of paper they discovered. The first was a handwritten song draft titled "Man Killer." The lyrics painted a chilling picture of a woman being murdered, strangled to death. The second paper was a supposed agreement written and signed by Laura, stating she'd give up custody of her children to Grant for $25,000. Anyone who knew Laura would have immediately called foul. Her children were her everything. There was no price tag she'd ever put on being with them. This agreement screamed forgery. At that point, police knew time was critical. They needed to find Grant and Amanda fast. Security camera footage gave them a clearer timeline. After July 13th, Amanda was spotted with the kids at a local Chick-fil-A. Grant, meanwhile, was seen shopping in the early hours of July 14th at both Walmart and Target in Raleigh. But what he purchased was downright disturbing. Goggles, bleach, trash bags, tape, a reciprocating saw and blades, and a lint roller. That wasn't all. Later that day, Amanda called her daughter with a strange request to take care of the kids for most of the day. Then, on July 16th, Grant was caught making another unnerving purchase, large quantities of ice and coolers. Shortly afterward, he rented a U-Haul trailer. He, Amanda, and the two boys headed to Richmond, Texas, supposedly to visit Amanda's sister, Karen Berry. They arrived around July 19th, but Grant made yet another suspicious stop, this time at a local Home Depot. His shopping list? Heavy-duty gloves and 8 bottles of acid. Texas police, now collaborating with North Carolina authorities, paid a visit to Karen Berry. What she told them was alarming. On the night of July 19th, Grant and Amanda had asked to borrow a boat. They wanted to go out to Oyster Creek, a remote gator-filled canal with thick vegetation and murky water. Grant and Amanda asked whether the alligators in Oyster Creek ate humans, whether wild hogs could consume flesh, and whether bloodthirsty sharks were native to Texas waters. Karen assumed these were just strange city questions. But to investigators, it was clear they were scouting a body dump site. A team of officers was sent to Oyster Creek immediately. Another team combed the area for surveillance footage. Tragically, both efforts bore fruit. In Oyster Creek, after hours of carefully navigating dangerous waters filled with reeds and lily pads, police discovered remains. They had found Laura. What was left of her had been so badly mutilated that even determining the exact cause of death was difficult. But forensic examiners concluded she had likely died from manual strangulation or a powerful blow to the neck. The evidence was overwhelming. The bleach-soaked apartment, the forged custody letter, the disturbing purchases, the chilling lyrics, and the remains in Oyster Creek. Laura's life had ended not in an accident, not in a moment of rage, but as the result of a calculated, cold-blooded plan. Grant Hayes and Amanda Perry Tucker were no longer just suspects, they were murderers. When investigators located Laura's car, a white 2006 Ford Focus, it was clear someone had gone to great lengths to clean it. The interior had been washed thoroughly, and there was visible damage to the rear of the vehicle. Then came even more damning footage. Surveillance showed Amanda near Karen Berry's home, discarding bottles of acid. Just 13 days after Laura was last seen, the case took a major turn. On July 25, 2011, Grant Hayes and Amanda Perry Tucker were arrested at Grant's parents' house in North Carolina. Both were charged in connection with Laura's death. Their trials were held separately, and as expected, each tried to shift the blame. Grant claimed that Laura had shown up at the apartment on July 13th and threatened Amanda, saying she'd take her daughter the same way her own sons had been taken. According to Grant, Amanda lashed out during the confrontation and killed Laura, while he only helped cover it up. Amanda, on the other hand, painted herself as a victim. She said Grant had been emotionally abusive and manipulative for years. Her version of events claimed that Laura and Grant got into a heated argument, and Laura accidentally hit her head during the fight, something Amanda conveniently didn't witness because she was in another room with the children. Amanda said that when Grant told her Laura was hurt, he instructed her to leave with the kids so he could call for help. She went to Chick-fil-A, and when she returned, Laura was gone. Grant then casually claimed that Laura was fine and had already left. It wasn't until they were in Texas, she said, that Grant confessed what had really happened, and then threatened her into helping him hide the truth. Despite their stories, the mountain of evidence said otherwise. Both Grant and Amanda pleaded not guilty, but the court didn't buy it. On September 16, 2013, Grant Hayes was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. His demeanor in court was chilling. He smiled, laughed, and showed no hint of remorse. It was as if he thought he was going on vacation, rather than facing justice for a brutal crime. Amanda's sentencing came months later, on February 19, 2014. She received a sentence of 13 to 16 years. During sentencing, the judge shared his perspective plainly. He believed Amanda could have stopped what happened to Laura. Instead, she chose to be a participant. She may have expressed remorse in court, but many questioned whether it was genuine or just another performance. But that wasn't the end for Amanda. Texas authorities charged her separately for tampering with evidence, and she was hit with an additional 20-year sentence. As for how this horrifying crime actually unfolded, investigators believe Grant lured Laura to his apartment under false pretenses. She was told she'd be able to see her boys, maybe even take them home. Grant may have even lied and said he was ready to give her full custody. That's the only explanation for why Laura would travel all the way from Kingston to Raleigh alone, especially when her friends had warned her never to meet Grant without backup. Tragically, Laura walked straight into a trap. One theory suggests that once she arrived, Grant and Amanda forced her to write and sign the so-called custody letter, threatening her with the loss of her children if she didn't comply. Then she was attacked, either strangled or struck with a fatal blow. It was cold, calculated, and devastatingly cruel. Why? Likely because Grant wanted Laura gone for good, out of the picture, so he could continue his life with Amanda, free of custody battles and court hearings. But the ultimate irony? Amanda and Grant divorced just a year later, in October 2014. Everything he did, all the lies, the violence, the destruction, ended in nothing. Today, Laura's two sons, along with Amanda's daughter Lillian, are in the care of Grant's parents. Thankfully, they are loving and nurturing, the exact opposite of their father. But it's heartbreaking to think of the childhood these boys lost, growing up without their mother because of their father's selfishness. Laura Ackerson was a vibrant, loving, creative woman, a devoted mother, a loyal friend, and a daughter who deserved so much more. Her death was the result of manipulation, control, and cruelty at its worst. And it's a powerful reminder of the importance of knowing your worth, setting boundaries, and walking away from those who mean you harm, no matter how much love you think you have to give. Laura didn't get the chance to start fresh, but maybe her story will help someone else realize it's never too late to choose yourself. Case 4. It started off like a normal night. Patrick Sean Betts, an 11-year-old boy from Upland, California, was out with his mom and sister at their favorite pizza place. He was happy, laughing, and doing what most kids loved to do in the 80s, playing arcade games and eating pizza. At one point, Patrick asked his mom for some change and went off to play in the back arcade. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but then something happened. Patrick walked out of that pizza place and never came home. What really happened that night? Why did it take so long for anyone to start looking for him? And how could a case with so many strange twists go unnoticed for so long? Patrick Sean Betts was born on June 21, 1976, to Dennis and Barbara Betts, longtime residents of Upland, California. He grew up surrounded by sunshine, skateboards, and the kind of freedom that only kids in the 80s truly understood. Patrick went to Vista Elementary, and from an early age, it was clear that he had a big personality packed into a small frame. His mom, Barbara, described him as cheerful and easygoing, while his friends saw someone a little more layered, playful and street smart, a kid who didn't fall for nonsense but still had a sparkle in his eye. He was polite, helpful, and had a natural curiosity, often spending time at the local radio shack where he liked to hang out. His humor was sharp for his age, the kind that made people laugh and want to be around him. One of the closest people in Patrick's life was Kevin, his best friend who lived just across the street. Kevin had some health issues that kept him homebound, and not many kids made the effort to connect with him, but Patrick did, wholeheartedly. The two became inseparable, their friendship rooted in trust and genuine kindness. Like many kids of the time, Patrick loved video games, baseball, and skateboarding. His bond with Kevin deepened his love for baseball, especially since Kevin's dad coached the local Little League team. At night, Patrick couldn't sleep without his favorite blanket, a soft, comforting item that, for him, meant security and home. Then came January 20th, 1988, a day no one in the Betts family would ever forget. It started off as nothing out of the ordinary. Patrick, his mom Barbara, and his older sister Pamela were enjoying an evening at Pizza Chalet, a popular family spot in Upland with a built-in arcade. Patrick, as usual, made a beeline for the games after asking his mom for some quarters. He had recently become friends with the son of the restaurant's owner, and the two would spend hours playing together there. Although Barbara didn't know this new friend very well, she felt comfortable enough to let Patrick go play. Later that evening, Patrick came back to his mom to ask if he could go to a basketball game at Upland High with his friend. Thinking the game was nearby and trusting her son's judgment, Barbara gave him the okay. As Patrick walked out the door, he turned and asked her to save him a slice of pizza. It was a casual moment, something any parent would hear and smile at, but tragically, it would be the last time Barbara ever saw her son. The game they had wanted to watch was actually in Chino, nearly 8 miles away, a fact that the boys hadn't realized. Disappointed, they returned to Pizza Chalet and passed the time by going back to the arcade. Patrick was last seen around 9 p.m. playing video games there. After that, he said he was heading home, but he never made it. That night, his family waited anxiously, watching the door, hoping he'd walk in, maybe a little embarrassed for being late. But hours passed. Then the entire night, when the sun rose, it brought only dread. Patrick was missing. One would assume the local police would launch a thorough investigation immediately, but that wasn't what happened. Instead, Upland authorities quickly brushed it off, suggesting that Patrick had simply run away. They told his devastated family he'd be back once he got hungry. This theory seemed absurd to Barbara and Dennis. Yes, Patrick had been involved in a minor school altercation shortly before his disappearance, and there was a scheduled juvenile court date coming up, but he wasn't anxious about it. He hadn't expressed any desire to run, and nothing in his behavior indicated he planned to. In fact, his favorite blanket, his nighttime must-have, was still in his room. His clothes, his belongings, everything was untouched. If Patrick had truly run away, wouldn't he have taken something with him? But investigators stuck to their runaway theory. No Amber Alerts, no immediate search, no sense of urgency. To make matters worse, Upland wasn't exactly the safest town. With a population of just over 78,000, the city had a crime rate a few percentage points higher than the national average. Statistically, 5 serious crimes happen there every day, enough to raise red flags, especially when a child vanished. Determined not to let their son become just another missing poster on a wall, the family launched their own search, going door to door through Upland with flyers and questions, for anyone who might have seen something, anything. Their first stop, of course, was Pizza Chalet, the last place Patrick had been seen. They asked around, desperate for a lead, and finally caught a possible break. A woman who worked at a nearby beauty supply store mentioned seeing Patrick walk in with an older teenage boy. At first, it seemed like a glimmer of hope, but the woman's memory was hazy. The details kept slipping. First she was sure, then unsure, and at one point she couldn't even recall if Patrick had been alone or not. The Betts family suspected the boy might have been the son of the pizzeria owner, but since the witness couldn't describe the teen clearly, there was no way to confirm it. Just like that, the lead fizzled out and they were back to square one. The emotional toll was unbearable. The family was growing more frantic by the day, and their pleas to the police became more desperate. They insisted again and again that Patrick had not run away. Finally, after nearly 4 months of pushing, the authorities agreed to fully investigate. But by then, for precious months had already passed. When it comes to missing persons, the first 48 to 72 hours are vital. It's during this short window that evidence is still fresh, and the chances of finding someone alive are significantly higher. Once that window closes, the likelihood of answers or recovery drops dramatically, and the Betts family knew it. Though they were relieved to see law enforcement finally involved, they couldn't shake the gut-wrenching feeling that the delay had cost them everything. Adding to their heartbreak was the complete lack of media coverage. Because police had initially labeled Patrick as a runaway, his disappearance was met with silence. Only a few articles ever made it to print, and there was virtually no attention from TV or local news outlets. It was as if Patrick had been forgotten before the search had even begun. But the family remembered everything, and they never stopped watching for anything strange. The day after Patrick vanished, something chilling happened. Sierra Vista Elementary received a phone call. The woman on the other end claimed to be Patrick's grandmother and told the school that he wouldn't be returning because he was moving to Washington to live with her. The call was deeply unsettling. For one, the voice didn't belong to Patrick's actual grandmother, but more disturbingly, the caller knew specific details. The name of Patrick's school and the fact that his real grandmother had once lived in Washington. In reality, Patrick's grandmother had moved from Washington to California months before his disappearance. She had been battling cancer, and Patrick adored her. He was always by her side, helping however he could. Tragically, she passed away still not knowing what had happened to her grandson. The eerie phone call left the family shaken. Was it someone trying to cover their tracks? Or a cruel prank? Either way, it added to the growing list of mysteries surrounding Patrick's disappearance. And because it was 1988, there was no way to trace the call. No caller ID, no digital footprint, just one more dead end. But the oddities didn't stop there. For months after Patrick disappeared, something else strange happened, this time involving the very place he had last been seen. Pizza Chalet, once a lively hangout for local families, abruptly shut down. The owners packed up and left Upland without warning. Word soon got out that they had relocated to Los Angeles, and when police followed up, they found the family, but only briefly. Before long, they left again, this time reportedly heading overseas to the Middle East, their country of origin. To the Betts family, this wasn't just odd, it was alarming. Why would a thriving business vanish so suddenly? Why leave so quickly, right after a child had gone missing on their premises? Investigators managed to track down the owners in Los Angeles, but not for long. Once they left the country, the trail went cold again. And worse, no one ever learned the name of the owner's son. The same boy Patrick had been seen playing with that night. That meant police couldn't interview him, and the possible connection the beauty store clerk mentioned could never be confirmed. Once again, the Betts family found themselves at a dead end. Their frustration was mounting. It was like they were trapped in a nightmare with no exit. Every potential lead ended in confusion or silence. And just when they thought things couldn't get more maddening, the police made a decision that left the family completely stunned. At one point, for reasons that still remain unclear, investigators in Upland turned their attention to an unexpected suspect, Patrick's older brother. He was just 15 years old when Patrick went missing, and yet somehow, police became convinced he was involved. How they arrived at that conclusion is anyone's guess. The problem? There wasn't a shred of evidence backing their claims. Patrick's brother had an ironclad alibi. On the night Patrick vanished, he was hundreds of miles away in San Francisco, performing with his band. His fellow bandmates confirmed he'd been on stage that entire night, 7 hours from Upland. There was no possible way he could have been involved, but that didn't stop the police. Without notifying his family, they took the teenager in for questioning and kept him for over 5 hours. When the Betts family finally found out and rushed to the station, they were horrified to learn he was in the middle of a polygraph test, a test he reportedly failed. From there, things escalated. Officers even ordered him to write a confession, despite having no grounds for such a demand. The Betts family was furious. Their grief had already consumed them, and now they were forced to watch another son get emotionally torn apart over baseless accusations. Tragically, the ordeal left permanent scars. Already struggling with anxiety, Patrick's brother later developed PTSD, a diagnosis that only deepened the community's suspicions instead of evoking sympathy. People assumed his trauma was a sign of guilt, when in reality, it was the aftermath of being wrongfully targeted at such a young age. Sadly, this wasn't the last time Upland investigators turned the Betts family's life upside down. In 1991, more than 3 years after Patrick vanished, the family was jolted awake before dawn by loud knocks and flashing lights. At 6 in the morning, Upland police returned, this time armed with a search warrant. The family, still disoriented and confused, looked out their windows to find their home surrounded by officers, bloodhounds, and even people in hazmat suits. They hadn't been given any warning or explanation. The search went on for more than 12 hours, stretching into the evening. Every room was examined, the backyard was combed through, and all without telling the family what they were even looking for. Months later, they finally found out why. An anonymous tip had been phoned in, claiming Patrick's body was buried somewhere beneath the house. Without verifying the legitimacy of the call, investigators charged ahead and treated the family like suspects. The experience left them shattered. According to Patrick's sister, who had just given birth to twins at the time, the officers were cold and dismissive, completely devoid of compassion. The search yielded nothing. Just like the tip, it led nowhere. And still no answers. Despite everything the family endured, Patrick's case remained in the shadows. It barely received any attention from the media. There were no televised appeals, no headlines, and only a handful of articles in local outlets. One of the only times Patrick's face reached a larger audience was in 1993, when his photo was featured in Soul Asylum's music video, Runaway Train. The video was part of a powerful campaign to raise awareness about missing children. Alongside 35 other faces, Patrick's image appeared, flickering on screen in the hope that someone somewhere might recognize him. And while the campaign was a rare success, 26 of the 36 children featured were found. It wasn't enough to bring Patrick home. Years passed. The case went cold. Then something strange happened. What happened next only deepened the mystery surrounding Patrick's disappearance. One day, while Patrick's nephew, now grown and working as a security officer, was on duty, an older man approached him and started making small talk. Nothing seemed unusual at first, until the stranger casually referred to Patrick by the name Sean. That was the name Patrick's friends and family always used, his middle name, the one rarely mentioned in public. The nephew had never shared that detail. What followed was even more disturbing. The man began talking about Patrick's case with surprising familiarity, as if he had followed it for years. He rattled off facts and details that left the nephew chilled. After all, Patrick's disappearance had never received much attention. Beyond a single appearance in a music video from the early 90s, his story remained largely unknown. So, how could a random man not only know his name, but also the intricate pieces of a case that barely anyone ever discussed? Some believed that perhaps the man had simply heard about Patrick growing up in Upland. Maybe it was just small-town knowledge passed along over the years. But Patrick's loved ones weren't convinced. They had always felt like his case had been ignored, brushed aside, not something strangers would remember, let alone bring up decades later. Unfortunately, no one was able to identify the man or find out where he came from. He vanished as quickly as he appeared, leaving behind nothing but unease and unanswered questions. In February 2022, after so many years of silence, Patrick's case found new life, thanks to the internet. A true crime YouTube channel called Crimehound featured Patrick's story after a subscriber from Upland requested it. That same month, a Upland City Council meeting became an emotional moment of public plea, as Patrick's 73-year-old mother, Barbara, and his sister, Pamela, stood before the mayor and council members asking for help. Stephen was also present and shared Patrick's story with the officials, hoping it would finally lead to answers. During that meeting, Barbara revealed something heartbreaking. Her husband, Dennis, Patrick's father, had passed away back in 2009 without ever knowing what happened to his son. Her voice trembled with grief as she explained that while she no longer believed Patrick was alive, she still clung to one final wish, to bring him home, even if it was only to lay him to rest. After more than 3 decades, her pain had not faded. It had simply settled deeper. Pamela, too, made a powerful demand. She urged law enforcement to use modern investigative tools, DNA profiling, forensic databases, anything available now that hadn't existed back then. Technology had evolved, she argued, and so had the chances of solving cold cases. But investigators hit the same wall they always had. Without a suspect or even a person of interest, they had no one from whom to collect DNA. Still, something had shifted. After years of stagnation, new eyes were finally looking at the case. Detectives began re-examining witness statements and reviewing possible leads. While no major breakthroughs had come yet, the renewed attention offered something the Betts family hadn't felt in years: hope. Sadly, Barbara's health was beginning to decline. Pamela expressed that they were now racing against time, not just to solve the mystery, but to give her mother the closure she had waited far too long for. Patrick would be 48 years old today. The idea that he might still be alive seems more and more unlikely. And yet, the thought that he may have been kidnapped and raised by someone else still lingers in the background. If he were out there, wouldn't he have come forward by now? Still, hope doesn't fade easily. Even if Patrick is no longer alive, the Betts family simply wants the truth. They want to know what happened. They want justice. They want peace. America, don't miss out. Case 5. Between 1977 and 1993, the strangled bodies of these 6 women were discovered in secluded areas around Kansas City, Missouri. But before you start thinking this is about Henry Wallace, the Charlotte Strangler, or Anthony Sowell, the Cleveland Strangler, which we've already covered, this is a completely different case. It remained a mystery for decades, until DNA advancements finally exposed the truth. And unlike the others, this killer managed to escape justice for decades, only to keep insisting he's innocent even after being directly linked to his victims. In fact, here's what he had to say. Because you believe you're an innocent man. No, I don't believe it. I know I am. Okay. And here's what his peers have to say about him. He was always eager to help or happy to help, and he never complained. He just did his job and did it with a smile. We've heard it time and time again. People who seem harmless, the kind you'd never suspect, turning out to be cold-blooded serial killers. And after covering so many cases, one thing stands out. Most of these killers targeted vulnerable women. Why? Because even back then, they knew the harsh truth that if a woman went missing, the cops wouldn't care. In this case, it's a chilling example of exactly that. It all started with Stacy L. Swafford, a 17-year-old girl who had run away from home and was trying to survive on the streets of Kansas City. Her body was found on April 17, 1977, face down in a vacant lot. An autopsy confirmed she had been strangled. Her mother, Georgine Swafford, never recovered from the loss and eventually passed away from alcohol poisoning, holding on to the belief that she would see her daughter again in heaven. Then came Gwendolyn Kazim, the youngest of the victims. Just 15 years old, she was found on January 23, 1980. Her body left behind a building with wire wrapped around her neck and wrists. She had been working as a prostitute, and her father had reported her missing only a day before, though he hadn't seen her for over a week. Her death, like the others, was ruled as strangulation. Margaret J. Miller, another 17-year-old girl, was found on May 9, 1982, in an open field by a teenage boy walking to his grandmother's house. She had been working on Troost Avenue, and when police found her, some of her belongings were missing. The cause of death? Strangulation. Catherine M. Berry was different. She wasn't a prostitute, but a woman struggling with mental illness after the birth of her third child. She lived on the streets, accepting rides from strangers. On March 14, 1986, her body was discovered in an abandoned building, covered with leaves, a nylon stocking around her neck. She too had been strangled. Naomi Kelly was a 23-year-old single mother trying to turn her life around. She had been studying business and raising 2 children, but on August 16, 1986, she was found in a rundown park, a towel tied around her neck and face. Her autopsy confirmed strangulation. Debbie Blevins, 32, was found naked except for pink socks on November 27, 1986. Her body had been dumped in front of a church after she had fallen into drug addiction. She left behind a 9-year-old daughter. The cause of death? Strangulation. And Barnes was 36 when her body was discovered near downtown Kansas City on April 17, 1987, exactly 10 years after Stacy L. Swafford was found. She had worked as a housekeeper and exotic dancer, but also engaged in prostitution. Like the others, she had been strangled. Kelly A. Ford was only 20 when she was found in Roanoke Park on June 9, 1987. She had moved to Kansas City after high school, hoping for a better life, but she too was strangled and left behind. Angela M. Mayhew, 19, was discovered face down on the side of the road on September 12, 1987. She had been strangled, and police later found hairs on her sweater that connected her death to the others. Shalia Ingold, 36, was found inside a van outside an auto repair shop on November 3, 1987. Her rings were missing, and her cause of death was, once again, strangulation. Carmeline R. Hibbs, 30, was found in a parking lot on December 19, 1987. She had been strangled and left behind like so many others. Connie Luther, 29, was found lying on a snowdrift on January 11, 1993. A shoelace was wrapped around her neck. She had been one of 5 children raised by a single mother who had passed away the year before. One by one women were turning up, assaulted, strangled, and left for dead. The patterns were screaming at the cops, yet somehow nobody put the pieces together. And if you think that's the worst of it, oh, you have no idea. There were more victims, so many more. But here's the part that'll make your blood boil. The man responsible was arrested multiple times for assault, and every single time he walked free. If the system had done its job, these women might still be alive. But it didn't. And the man behind this nightmare? Lorenzo Gilliard, the trash collector strangler. But here's what makes it even scarier. Lorenzo Gilliard wasn't some creepy guy lurking in the shadows. No, he was the last person you'd suspect. A hard-working trash truck driver who climbed his way up to management. A guy with a friendly smile, a solid job, and coworkers who swore he was one of the nicest people around. And that right there? That's the terrifying part. Because time and time again, history has proven that the most dangerous killers, they aren't the ones hiding in the dark. They're the ones hiding in plain sight. Born and raised in Kansas City, Missouri, Lorenzo was one of 5 children. Even as a child, his aggressive nature stood out. At school, he played sports with his brothers. but his larger-than-average size made him intimidating. And he didn't just use his strength on the field. He had a reputation for bullying smaller kids. His lack of discipline, poor grades, and constant skipping of school led him to drop out before he could even reach the 10th grade. By the mid-1960s, he met a young woman named Rena Hill, and the two quickly became a couple. Their relationship took a serious turn when Rena became pregnant, and on November 20th, 1968, they got married. But tying the knot didn't change Lorenzo's violent tendencies. Instead, he fell deeper into crime and began showing disturbing behaviors toward women. In January of 1969, he was arrested for assaulting and sexually touching a girl he knew. However, he was released after what authorities called a reconciliation agreement, in which the victim retracted her statement after Lorenzo apologized. But an apology wasn't going to stop him from harming more women. Adding to the horror, his family history was just as disturbing. In 1970, his own father, Lorenzo Gilliard Sr., was convicted of rape. Just 2 years later, Lorenzo Jr. found himself in trouble again, this time for sexually violating and assaulting another woman. She bravely identified him in a police lineup, saying he had choked her unconscious. But somehow, the authorities decided her testimony wasn't strong enough, and they dropped the charges. That single decision, letting him go, turned out to be a catastrophic mistake. In 1973, Lorenzo's violent nature wasn't just terrorizing strangers, it was destroying his own home. That year, he was arrested for physically and sexually assaulting his wife, who bravely told the police that he had been abusing her for their entire marriage. But, as expected, when a black woman is the victim, justice was nowhere to be found. Instead of real consequences, no prison time, no lasting punishment. Lorenzo walked away with nothing more than a fine and a divorce. Just like that, he was free to do it all over again. This man was beyond despicable. Not only was he abusive toward his wife, but he was aggressive toward other women in public, and the worst part, the police did absolutely nothing. Then, in February of 1974, he was arrested again, this time for attacking a 25-year-old exotic dancer. She identified him in a lineup. But just like before, the charges were magically dropped because of a so-called reconciliation agreement. And then just 5 months later, he did it again. This time, he went after a 13-year-old girl, a child. She was the daughter of a friend, and he assaulted her near the Missouri River. But when the girl changed her statement, the charges were dropped again. So let that sink in. A fully grown man harmed a 13-year-old, and he still walked free. However, this time, he got a tiny bit of punishment, if you can even call it that. He was convicted of an unlawful act with a minor and sentenced to 9 months in jail. 9 months. That's it. Less than a year. Not even long enough for the world to forget his name. And somehow, after all of this, he got married again. But of course, that didn't last long. His second wife left him, saying the same thing his first wife did. He was violent, abusive, and dangerous. Then, in the late 1970s, he got married a third time. Can you believe it? Even with all the evil he had done, he still managed to convince another woman he was worth marrying. By 1979, he was back at it again. This time, he attacked a young couple, assaulting the woman and threatening to kill her fiancé. Both victims identified him as their attacker. Yet somehow, at his trial in September of 1980, a jury acquitted him due to lack of evidence. A few months later, he was arrested for aggravated assault against his third wife. And guess what? Another joke of a punishment, a fine, and another divorce. That's it. He walked free yet again. Then came 1981, and things escalated to an entirely new level of horror. He attacked his ex-wife not once, but twice. The first time, he knocked out her front teeth. The second time, he stabbed her in the hand with an ice pick. Surely, this had to be the moment they finally locked him up, right? Wrong. He was charged with third-degree assault, but was let off with probation. Fast forward to 1991, and surprise, surprise, he was arrested yet again, this time for theft. But he paid $3,500 in bail and walked free. The following spring, he finally received 4 years in prison. Not for his past violent crimes, not for hurting women, not for assaulting a child, but for violating his probation. Imagine that. All the women he hurt, all the lives he destroyed, and what finally put him behind bars was violating probation. Not the blood on his hands, not the years of trauma he inflicted, just a probation violation. And here's another twist in this nightmare story. His sister Patricia Dixon was just as deadly. In 1983, She was convicted of murdering a client while working as a prostitute and was sentenced to 11 years in prison. Then came January 10th, 1983. Lorenzo was released from prison, only to be thrown back in shortly after when he was arrested in Wyandotte County, Kansas, for making bomb threats. But just like every other time, his stay in jail didn't last long. By late 1985, he was back on the streets, free to continue his life as if nothing had happened. In January of 1986, he landed a job as a garbage man at Defenbaugh Disposal Service, where his father worked in the maintenance department. Just a regular guy with a regular job, living a regular life. At least, that's how it seemed. But the truth? Lorenzo's past was far from forgotten. On December 23, 1987, he was arrested and interrogated as a potential suspect in the murder of 36-year-old Sheila Ingold. The police took his blood sample, hoping it would tie him to the crime. But just like every other time, there wasn't enough evidence to keep him locked up. And so, he walked free once again. By 1991, he had married for a fourth time, somehow still managing to convince women that he was a decent man. Not only that, he was promoted to company supervisor, giving him control over multiple garbage disposal teams in parts of Kansas City. But karma has a way of creeping up, even on those who think they're untouchable. In July of 1996, one of Lorenzo's neighbors went to the police, accusing him of sexual harassment. She claimed that the harassment had been happening since September of 1995, nearly a year of torment. And yet, even after she came forward, no charges were brought against him. The result? She was the one who had to leave. She moved away, forced to uproot her life because law enforcement refused to help her. That's the reality of the world we live in. When justice fails, victims are left with no choice but to save themselves. But something strange happened after that. Lorenzo seemed to go quiet. From 1993 onward, there were no known crimes attached to his name. Friends and acquaintances began speaking about him in a positive light, as if his past had somehow been wiped clean. That is, until 2001, when the Kansas City Police Department received a multi-million-dollar federal grant to re-examine cold cases using new DNA technology. And that's when the truth finally surfaced. The blood sample taken from Lorenzo back in 1987 was tested again, and this time there was no escaping justice. Lorenzo Gilliard was conclusively linked to the murders of 6 women, including Sheila Ingold, the very woman he had been suspected of killing years before. But that wasn't all. Circumstantial evidence connected him to 6 more murders, bringing the total to at least 12 victims. His victims, women between the ages of 15 and 36, had all been killed the same way, strangled with nylon stockings, shoelaces, or wire. Their bodies were dumped in landfills, snowdrifts, abandoned buildings, vans, fields, and parking lots, discarded like trash. And yet despite the pattern, despite the overwhelming number of victims, no one had rushed to solve their cases. No one had sounded the alarm that a serial killer was hunting women in Kansas City. Why? Because of who his victims were. Most of them were sex workers, women whose society had already turned its back on. Their deaths barely made the news. Their cases were brushed aside. No headlines, no national coverage, no public outcry. Just another woman found dead in a landfill, barely more than a footnote in history. In addition to the women we already know Lorenzo Gilliard killed, there were others. Women whose lives ended in the same brutal fashion, discarded as if they never mattered. Investigators suspected more victims, but not all of their names were made public. Then, on June 23, 2006, a breakthrough came. DNA analysis linked Gilliard to yet another murder. Helga Kruger, a 26-year-old Austrian immigrant, came to America chasing the promise of a better life. Instead, in February of 1989, she met a violent and tragic end. Her body was discovered, strangled with a towel. The eerie similarities between her death and the others painted a chilling picture, almost like a ritual. Yet for years, no one connected the dots. And that's the real tragedy. These women were forgotten because they were seen as disposable. They weren't high-profile cases. They weren't wealthy. And many of them didn't have families desperately searching for them. Some weren't even reported missing. They were women who slipped through the cracks of society, making them the perfect prey for a man like Lorenzo Gilliard. And it wasn't until January of 2007 that Gilliard's luck ran out. His attorneys struck a deal with prosecutors. If he agreed to waive his right to a jury trial, the death penalty would be taken off the table. It was a desperate move, but one that ensured he would at least have the slimmest chance at avoiding the harshest sentence. The trial began on March 5th, and the prosecution built their case on DNA evidence, linking Gilliard to the victims. The evidence was undeniable. His DNA was found on multiple women, placing him at the scene of the murders. And yet, he never broke. Every single victim had something in common. They were all found in isolated locations. They were all strangled. They all showed signs of struggling. They were all missing their shoes, and almost every one of them had been sexually assaulted. It was a clear pattern, a signature, and it pointed straight to Gilliard. Still, he refused to admit guilt. Even when confronted with forensic proof, he insisted he had never met the victims. But when every single prostitute you've been with ends up dead, when your DNA is found on their bodies just before their murders, how do you continue to claim innocence? The arrogance of it is staggering. Maybe he thought he could talk his way out of it, just like he had for decades. Maybe he thought the justice system would fail these women one last time. But this time, his lies weren't enough. His luck had finally run out. 12 days later, on March 17, 2007, Lorenzo Gilliard was convicted of 6 murders and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was found guilty of killing Catherine Barry, Naomi Kelly and Barnes, Kelly Ford, Sheila Ingold, and Carmeline Hibbs. Though evidence linked him to other murders, some cases couldn't be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, so he wasn't convicted for those. But whether the courts officially acknowledged them or not, everyone knew the truth. This man had killed far more than 6 women. He was one of the most prolific serial killers in Missouri's history, and yet his name is barely spoken. Then, in 2018, Gilliard resurfaced in the public eye when British journalist Piers Morgan confronted him in a televised prison interview. Morgan didn't waste time with small talk. He asked him point blank if he thought people were stupid enough to believe his denials. The question cut through Gilliard's composure, and instead of answering, he ripped off his microphone and stormed out. Even now, in his 70s, serving multiple life sentences, he refuses to admit what he did. He still clings to the lies that allowed him to kill for so long. This case is a brutal reminder of how easily some victims are ignored. These women were abandoned in life and forgotten in death, and that's why it's important to remember them, to say their names, to refuse to let their stories fade into nothing. Because if we don't, then killers like Lorenzo Gilliard get exactly what they want: erased victims, unanswered questions, and the comfort of knowing that no one cared enough to fight for justice. Now, I want to hear your thoughts on this. Case 6. These 2 little boys were the perfect example of how sometimes the real danger isn't lurking outside. It's sitting right across the dinner table. On the night of November 26, 2001, a quiet evening in Cantonment, Florida erupted into chaos. A frantic 911 call sent firefighters racing to a home engulfed in flames. First responders rushed in, expecting to find a tragic accident, maybe even a desperate attempt at escape gone wrong. But as they made their way inside, what they discovered was far worse than a fire. Lying motionless on the living room floor was 40-year-old Terry King. His body was twisted unnaturally, his head bashed in with such force that his skull was shattered beyond recognition. The fire, now clearly an afterthought, had been set to cover up something much darker. Terry hadn't died in the flames. Instead, he had been murdered in cold blood. But as investigators processed the gruesome scene, they quickly realized something even more disturbing. Terry's 2 sons, 13-year-old Derek and 12-year-old Alex, were nowhere to be found. At first, the situation seemed like an unspeakable tragedy. A father dead, his children possibly kidnapped, or even worse, trapped inside the burning house. But the truth that unfolded over the next few hours was something no one could have expected. When authorities located Derek and Alex nearby, the boys didn't run. They didn't cry. They didn't even hesitate. Instead, they calmly confessed. They had taken a baseball bat, crept into their father's room while he slept, and repeatedly beat him until his skull caved in. And then, as if that wasn't horrifying enough, they set the house on fire in an attempt to erase their crime. At first, their reasoning seemed simple. They claimed their father was too strict, that his punishments were too harsh. Spankings, rules, a home with too many restrictions. That was why they did it, they said. But something about their confession felt off. Their words were rehearsed, their emotions strangely absent. And then, just as quickly as they had admitted to the crime, they changed their story. Now, they said they weren't acting alone. A new name surfaced: 40-year-old Ricky Chavez, a local man who had been a family friend. According to the boys, Chavez had manipulated them, convinced them to kill their father, and after the crime, took them in, washing their bloody clothes and coaching them on what to say. He had given them a place to stay, a place where they wouldn't have to follow rules or face their father's discipline. But when pressed for details, the story changed yet again. Suddenly, Derek and Alex claimed that they never killed their father at all. Ricky Chavez had done it, they insisted. He had beaten Terry to death, then forced them to take the blame. Each new version of events contradicted the last, leaving investigators struggling to separate truth from lies. But then a chilling revelation came to light, one that would shake the case to its core. Alex revealed that his relationship with Ricky Chavez wasn't just that of a family friend. According to him, Chavez had manipulated him into believing they were in love. He described a twisted dynamic where Chavez, a grown man, had taken advantage of him, convincing him that they shared something special. With every revelation, the case became more unsettling. Was this the story of two boys rebelling against an overly strict father? Or were they victims themselves, manipulated by a predator who had used them to carry out his own dark agenda? Before we begin to dissect every inch of this case, let's take a moment to understand the King family first. Terry Lee King was born in Florida on April 17, 1961. He met Janet Little at a young age, and by the time Terry was 23, the two had started living together. They went on to have two sons, Derek, born in 1988, and Alex, who followed just 14 months later. Life wasn't easy for the young couple. Financial struggles weighed them down, and by the time their boys were just toddlers, things took a turn for the worse. Their relationship fell apart, but even after breaking up, Terry and Janet continued living under the same roof for about 2 years. During this time, Janet gave birth to twins fathered by another man. Despite their split, Terry attempted to co-parent all 4 children with Janet, trying to make the best of a complicated situation. But raising 4 young children with limited resources became overwhelming. Desperate for a solution, the couple turned to the Heritage Christian Academy, a church-run institution that provided shelter for struggling families. The director introduced them to the idea of open adoptions, assuring them that their children would live with new families while still staying in touch with their biological parents. Believing this was in their children's best interest, Terry and Janet made the heartbreaking decision to give them up. Soon after, Janet moved out of Terry's home, leaving him behind to start over. Terry picked up another job, but it paid little, and he was barely getting by. 8 months later, another blow hit the family. The church shut down, unable to afford the costs of caring for the children. The 4 siblings were separated, each sent to different families across the state. Derek and Alex, once inseparable, were now miles apart. Alex, in particular, struggled. No matter how much his new family tried, he couldn't adjust. He cried endlessly, mourning the loss of his father. His distress became so unbearable that his foster parents ultimately sent him back to Terry. The boy clung to his father like a lifeline, refusing to be apart from him again. While Terry worked, Alex would sit quietly in the lunchroom playing by himself, and at night, he made a makeshift bed by pushing 2 chairs together, anything just to be near his dad. Meanwhile, Derek took a different path. As he grew older, his rebellious streak intensified. By the year 2001, Janet received a call from his foster parents. They could no longer handle him. They were at their breaking point, and just like that, Derek was sent back to Terry, reuniting with his younger brother. Around the same time, Janet had moved to Lexington, Kentucky, after marrying another man, while Terry had finally reached some stability. He had bought a rental home with a large garden, creating what seemed like a fresh start for his boys. Derek and Alex were enrolled at Ransom Middle School, and at first, things seemed to be settling down. They were bright kids, performing above average in their classes. But just as life started to resemble some kind of normalcy, everything unraveled. On November 16th, the boys vanished. Terry reported them missing, frantic with worry. Days passed, and then he received a phone call from his own children. They told him to stop looking for them, but Terry refused to give up. Frustrated by what he believed was police inaction, he even went to the local news, pleading for help. Then, on November 24th, there was a breakthrough. Derek was found wandering near a wooded area in Pace. The next day, Alex resurfaced, returning home. Neighbors saw the 3 of them together, preparing to leave the house to visit a friend. It looked like things might return to normal. Later that night, they came back home. But within hours, their house was engulfed in flames. Firefighters rushed to the scene, but what they found inside was far more horrifying than the fire itself. Authorities quickly pieced together the gruesome truth. The attack had happened in the dead of night. Terry had been asleep in his recliner, completely unaware that his own children were lurking in the shadows. Derek, gripping an aluminum baseball bat, struck the first blow. Then another, and another. It was a ruthless, frenzied assault. The man who had fought so hard to keep his sons together was left unrecognizable. His skull had been shattered. As his lifeless body lay there, the boys set the house on fire, hoping the flames would erase the evidence. But fire doesn't destroy everything. Instead of seeking help, Derek and Alex fled. They didn't go to the police or a family member. They ran straight into the arms of Ricky Chavez, a man who had been lurking in the background of their lives for some time. Chavez wasn't just a family friend. He was a convicted felon with a troubling history. While Terry had been busy working hard as a single father, Chavez had been keeping a watchful eye on his boys, offering them an escape from their strict household. His home was their hideaway, a place where rules didn't apply. Investigators soon uncovered disturbing details. Chavez had more than just a casual friendship with the boys. He had introduced them to alcohol and marijuana, blurring the lines of authority. But the most unsettling revelation came from Alex himself. He confessed that he and Chavez weren't just friends. He claimed they were lovers. Chavez had manipulated him, convinced him they were in love. Authorities found letters, love notes written by Chavez to Alex, diary entries from the young boy professing his devotion to the 40-year-old man. It was clear this was grooming, and it raised a terrifying question. Had Chavez orchestrated the murder of Terry King? To understand just how deep Chavez's influence ran, you have to understand who he was in their lives. Every neighborhood has that one house, the one where kids gather, where rules are flexible, where no one asks too many questions. For Derek and Alex, that house belonged to Ricky Chavez. To some, he was just a friendly neighbor, the guy who let kids hang out at his place, play video games, and escape their troubles. But to others, there was something unsettling about him. Rumors swirled. Over the years, multiple minors had come forward with allegations of inappropriate relationships with Chavez. Yet, somehow nothing ever stuck. As a father juggling work and raising 2 kids, Terry King had no idea about Chavez's past when he first allowed his sons to spend time there. As a struggling single father, he saw it as a blessing, someone willing to watch over Derek and Alex when he was working long hours. But the relationship between Chavez and the boys became too close. Prosecutors had a tangled case on their hands. 2 minors accused of patricide, a felon with suspicious ties to them, and a defense riddled with inconsistencies in statements of 2 young, angry boys. Alex took the stand first, his testimony retelling a horrific tale. On the night of the murder, he claimed, Chavez had sneaked into the house while Terry was asleep. The brothers had been woken and led outside, told to wait in the car while Chavez carried out the evils that he had kept hidden all these years. It wasn't until they reached Chavez's home that he revealed the truth. Terry, their father, was dead. The crime, he insisted, had been for them. The alternative, he allegedly warned, was far worse. Terry would have never allowed them to live with Chavez, even if it meant taking their lives himself. As the jury absorbed the disturbing details, Derek King supported his brother's version of events, though his emotions overwhelmed him. He spoke of how Chavez had promised them a better life, a life where they would be free, taken care of, and given everything they wanted. Yet, as he tried to put into words the gravity of what had happened, his composure shattered, which revealed the confusion of a child caught in the midst of something far beyond his understanding. With the prosecution's case laid out, the defense turned its attention to one crucial element, the confession. When the boys had first been arrested, they had admitted to the crime, offering chilling descriptions of their father's final moments. The defense seized upon this and argued that their detailed account clearly showed they had been present during the attack, not waiting outside in Chavez's car as they now claimed. The jury deliberated, reaching a decision in a short time. However, the verdict was sealed, its contents hidden until the conclusion of the second trial, the one in which Alex and Derek King, still barely more than children, would stand accused of the same crime. As the trial of the King brothers commenced, the 2 young defendants now sat in the courtroom in their best clothes, no longer just witnesses but accused murderers. The prosecution put forth an argument backed by tangible evidence that Alex had harbored a deep resentment toward his father and had convinced his younger brother to act. The motive, they argued, lay in Alex's infatuation with Chavez, a man who had fed him fantasies of love and freedom from his evil father. This was backed by the letters that were found at the scene, one of which read something like this: My life used to be cloudy before I made friends with Rick. My ultimate goal in life now is what is. It is about sharing your life with someone else's. Before I met Rick, I was straight, but now I am gay. Unlike before, Derek did not testify, but Alex once again took the stand. The court listened as the prosecution introduced the deeply unsettling letters written by the boy, in which he described how Chavis had changed him, how he no longer saw himself as straight, how his ultimate goal in life was to be with the older man. These letters, the prosecution argued, showed the dangerous and strong influence Chavis had over Alex, an influence firm enough to push him toward murder. The defense, however, turned the focus back to Chavis. They painted him as a manipulative predator who had lured the boys into his grasp, exploiting their troubled home life and preying on their vulnerabilities. He had given them gifts, let them indulge in forbidden pleasures, and most importantly, convinced them that Terry King was the enemy. To Alex and Derek, he had been the savior they thought they needed, until they were left alone to take the fall. The jury weighed the conflicting narratives carefully. Were these two boys, still so childlike in their behavior, truly capable of such a heinous crime on their own? Or had they been merely pawns in a far darker game? The final answer came swiftly. In just 5 hours, the verdict was in. Alex and Derek King were found guilty. Their knowledge of the crime scene, their shifting testimonies, and their own confession ultimately convinced the jury that they had been present when their father was murdered. Case number 015612B. Verdict. We, the jury, find as follows as to count 1 of the indictment. Guilty of second-degree murder, a lesser-included offense, without a weapon. We, the jury, find as follows as to count 2 of the indictment. Guilty of arson as charged. So say we all this 6th day of September, 2002 for person Lynn Schwartz. State of Florida plaintiff versus Alex King defendant. Case number 015612B. Verdict. We, the jury, find as follows as to count 1 of the indictment. Guilty of second-degree murder, a lesser-included offense, without a weapon. Yet the court also seemed to acknowledge the complexities of the case. As most children their age prepared to return to school, Alex and Derek King prepared for a very different kind of future. A future inside the walls of Florida's juvenile detention centers. They had entered the world as victims, suspects, and pawns in a deadly game. And now they would pay for a crime whose true mastermind remained a mystery in the eyes of many. In an unconventional move, the prosecution tried both Chavis and the King brothers for the same crime. Chavis was acquitted despite the damning letters and his attempts to cover up the murder. The King brothers, however, were convicted of second-degree murder on September 6, 2002. But in yet another twist, the judge overturned their convictions, citing violations of due process. Rather than face another trial, the prosecution and defense reached a plea deal. Both Derek and Alex pleaded guilty to third-degree murder. Derek was sentenced to 8 years, Alex 7. But was justice truly served? Why did nobody consider the disturbing relationship of a minor with a convicted felon? Almost nobody would ask this question. Derek and Alex King entered prison as children and left as men. Long after the trials had ended and the headlines had begun to fade, the King brothers still had those who remained invested in their fate. Among them was journalist and writer Catherine Medico, whose interest in their case had shifted from professional to deeply personal. What had started as research for a book had transformed into an emotional bond, particularly with Alex. She had spent months exchanging letters with him, their conversations stretching over long phone calls. But it wasn't until late 2002 that she finally met him in prison. From the moment they were face to face, she felt an instant connection, as though he were a child in desperate need of care. Catherine was not alone in this sentiment. In different corners of the country, strangers had been drawn to the case, outraged by the way 2 children had been thrust into the adult legal system. Their frustration turned into action, culminating in the formation of the King Brothers Trust in 2003. Lisa Drew Alton spearheaded the initiative, determined to provide support for the boys once they were released. It was, she believed, a gesture of faith, an assurance that despite their past, they would not have to navigate their future alone. Among those who became involved was Dan Daly, a widower and freelance writer from Texas. Through online discussions about the case, he had connected with Lisa, who suggested he send Derek books in prison. A simple act of kindness turned into something much more when he received a heartfelt thank you letter from the boy. That letter marked the beginning of an unexpected friendship. Over time, they corresponded frequently, and Daley made the long drive to Florida several times to visit Derek behind bars. He was struck by the boy's openness, the way he spoke about his guilt without hesitation. For Daley, the relationship was not about the notoriety of the case, but about helping a young life find direction after a tragic past. As Alex and Derek spent their formative years behind bars, these unlikely supporters waited for them on the outside. But there remained a looming question. Were the boys worth saving? Would they emerge from prison rehabilitated, or would they become hard-hearted criminals like so many before them? When Alex King finally walked free, he did not dwell on the past. At 19, nearly a year and a half out of prison, he presented himself as someone who had left the darkness behind. He had built a new life, one he never imagined possible, with a family that embraced him as one of their own. Prison had changed him, though for years he had felt emotionally numb, disconnected from reality. The full weight of his circumstances had not sunk in until he made a reckless mistake, one that nearly cost him his freedom all over again. In April 2005, with 3 years remaining on his sentence, Alex and another inmate attempted an escape. Their plan had been amateurish at best, stuffing their beds to make it appear as though they were still sleeping, then slipping into a classroom where they attempted to climb through the ceiling. The plan failed, and they found themselves right back where they started, caught before they even had a chance to make it beyond the walls of the facility. The consequences were severe. Arrested and booked on new charges, Alex faced the terrifying possibility of an additional 15 years behind bars. It was then that Catherine Medico rushed to see him, shaken by the news. When she expressed her worry, his response was dismissive. She wasn't his mother, he told her, but she refused to accept that. In her eyes, Alex was as much her child as her own biological children. Something in that moment shifted. The next time she received a letter from him, it was addressed simply, "Dear Mother." From that day forward, he never called her anything else. Derek was released at the age of 20 in 2009, after serving 7 years. Alex was freed a year earlier, in 2008, at the age of 18. But freedom didn't guarantee a new beginning. Alex King's life had been anything but ordinary. From a troubled childhood to a high-profile murder trial, his past had always loomed over him like a shadow he could never escape. And now, at just 35 years old, his story had come to a tragic end. For years, Alex struggled with drug addiction, a battle that, according to his uncle Greg King, had consumed him. The last time Greg saw Alex was 5 years ago in Pensacola. He had urged his nephew to enter a rehab program, but Alex found it difficult to handle confinement yet again. Whether it was prison walls or the strict rules of rehab, he always found a way to run. On April 14th, Alex was found unresponsive in Missoula, Montana, after a drug overdose. Doctors at Providence St. Patrick Hospital fought to save him, but the damage had been done. It wasn't his first overdose in recent weeks. In fact, the doctor treating him recognized him immediately. Alex had already been in the hospital several times before. This time around, however, he wasn't so lucky. His heart had stopped. Medical staff worked desperately to revive him, but after days on life support, Alex King was declared legally dead on April 23, 2024. His family gathered for a final goodbye, though not in person. His last moments were witnessed through a screen, a heartbreaking farewell from miles away. He had once been the boy at the center of a case that captivated the nation, the child who made a confession that changed everything. But in the end, Alex King was just another lost soul, caught in the tight grip of a past that never let him go. And Ricky Chavez? He remains incarcerated, serving a 35-year sentence, not for murder, but for false imprisonment and being an accessory to the crime. The murder of Terry King also ignited a media firestorm. Were the boys victims of abuse or cold-blooded killers? A book, A Perversion of Justice, A Southern Tragedy of Murder, Lies and Innocence Betrayed, argued that they were innocent. But Assistant State Attorney David Rimmer had his own take. There will always be people who believe Derek and Alex are innocent, just like there will always be people who believe that Michael Jackson is innocent. The murder of Terry King was not just a local tragedy. It became a nationwide sensation, dividing public opinion and sparking heated debates about justice, abuse, and manipulation. One of the most controversial takes on the case came from authors Catherine Medico and Molly Barrows in their book, A Perversion of Justice, A Southern Tragedy of Murder, Lies and Innocence Betrayed. The book painted the King brothers not as cold-blooded killers, but as victims, children caught in a web of manipulation and discrepancies in the legal system. It suggested that the justice system failed them, raising a question that left goosebumps. Were the boys innocent all along? Years after their release, Derek and Alex King sat down for an exclusive Dateline NBC interview in a special titled Second Chances. For the first time in years, the brothers reunited on camera, their faces now marked by time and the weight of their past. They reflected on the choices that led them to that fateful night and the scars they carried from it. The case was also the subject of Evil Kin Season 1, Episode 5, titled Deadly Darlings. The episode delved deep into the chilling bond between the King brothers and the sinister influence of Ricky Chavez. The legal battle that followed was examined in American Justice Season 12, Episode 21, Blood Brothers, the Derek and Alex King case. It presented the twists and turns of the trial, leaving audiences to decide, were these boys monsters or merely pawns in a much larger, darker game? Even decades later, the story of Terry King's murder remains as unsettling as ever. Some still believe justice was served, while others insist that the full truth has yet to be uncovered. Case 7. This was the last the world saw of Raymond Radema, jailed for life for killing 7 people. This man was convicted of slaughtering 7 people, including his own children, and as you can see, he still had the audacity to blow a kiss at the camera as if nothing had happened. That eerie moment alone cements him as one of the most cold-blooded mass murderers in New Zealand, and the name starts with Raymond Wayne Radema, a man whose actions shook the peaceful town of Masterton, a place where people believed they were safe, where families built their lives, and where crime on such a horrific scale was nearly unthinkable. But in June of the year 1992, that belief was shattered forever. Masterton, at that time, was a relatively small and tight-knit community, known for its rural charm and quiet suburban life. Located in the Wairarapa region, the town was surrounded by lush green farmland, rolling hills, and a landscape that painted a picture of serenity. The economy was primarily driven by agriculture, with sheep farming being one of the dominant industries. Many of the town's residents either worked in farming or supporting industries such as wool processing, small-scale manufacturing, and retail. The pace of life was slow and predictable, and violent crime was a rarity. However, beneath this picturesque surface, economic struggles were beginning to take root. The early 90s saw New Zealand grappling with the effects of economic reforms from the previous decade. Many families, particularly those in working-class communities like Masterton, were feeling the pressure of rising unemployment and financial instability. Jobs were scarce, wages were low, and welfare support was often inadequate. For someone like Radema, who was already struggling to provide for his family, these factors only added to his growing frustration and desperation. Now, while there's not much known about the early life of Radema, or even how he met his wife, what we do know is that by the beginning of that fateful year, his life had begun to spiral downward. At the age of 25, Radema and his wife Toni were struggling to keep their heads above water. Financial hardship weighed them down, making it impossible for them to keep up with the rising rent. With 3 young children to care for, they were forced to move into Toni's parents' home on Judd Street, Masterton. Living under the same roof as extended family members wasn't easy. The house was crowded, tensions were high, and Radema's relationship with Toni was crumbling under the pressure. Arguments became more frequent, emotions ran high, and resentment festered. It was in this suffocating environment that the seeds of rage were planted. As the months dragged on, Radema's anger only grew. It wasn't just the financial struggles, though they played a significant role. It was the feeling of being powerless, of being unwanted, of watching his world crumble before his eyes. He reached out for help. He sought assistance from social services, hoping for some relief, some way to get back on his feet. But the help he needed never came. He was left to stew in his despair, and that despair quickly turned into a murderous rage. By June, Radema's marriage had completely fallen apart. A serious altercation between him, his wife, and her family was the final breaking point. He was thrown out of the house, rejected, cast aside. With nowhere to go and no support, his mind began to unravel. Days of little sleep, wandering with nothing but his anger and hopelessness for company, led him to one horrifying conclusion. If he couldn't have his family, no one would. On the night of June 26, 1992, Toni left the house to meet her parents, Philip and Rebecca Ferguson, at a local pub. She left behind her 3 young sons, Pierre, Barney, and Stacy, under the care of her sister, Nicola. Also in the house that night were Toni's brother, Philip, Nicola's de facto partner, Bevan Tepu, and their young son, Stephen. It was at precisely 9:25 in the evening, when Raymond Radama stormed back into the house, armed with a knife and a softball bat. The brutal attack that followed was nothing short of a massacre. He slaughtered everyone inside. He bludgeoned and stabbed 7 people to death, showing no mercy. Even his own children, his flesh and blood, were not spared. In a chilling act, he placed their lifeless bodies on his wife's bed and laid a Bible on top of them, as if it were some twisted attempt at absolution. The adults were no luckier. He piled their bodies on top of one another in another bedroom, stacking them like objects in a scene too gruesome to comprehend. But Radama's bloodlust was not yet satisfied. He sat in the house, waiting for Tony and her parents to return, so he could finish what he had started. When they finally walked through the door, the nightmare continued. Nicola's father, Philip, was the first to be attacked. Radama swung the softball bat with full force, striking him in a brutal assault. But this time things did not go according to plan. In the chaos, Tony managed to escape, running for her life to call for help. When the police arrived, the carnage they witnessed would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Blood soaked the floors, lifeless bodies filled the rooms, and in the midst of it all was Raymond Radama, subdued, restrained, and no longer in control. Nicola's father, Philip, had overpowered him, preventing an even greater tragedy. The news of the massacre spread like wildfire. New Zealand had never seen such a horrifying crime. A father, a husband, a son-in-law, someone who was supposed to protect his family, had instead wiped them out in cold blood. The community of Masterton was left reeling, struggling to understand how something so monstrous could have happened in their quiet town. Radama was arrested on the scene and taken into custody. His initial demeanor was eerily calm, as if he had accepted his fate. He offered little resistance, making no attempt to flee. During questioning, he showed minimal emotion, providing cold, matter-of-fact responses. Investigators were disturbed by his apparent lack of remorse. When Radama stood trial, the nation watched in shock. He expressed remorse, but the sheer brutality of his crimes left many wondering if it was genuine or merely an attempt to save himself from the harshest punishment. During the trial, the prosecution painted a picture of a man who had allowed his rage and feelings of inadequacy to fester for too long. The defense, on the other hand, argued that Radama had been pushed to his breaking point due to financial strain and rejection by his wife's family. Mental health professionals were brought in to assess his state of mind, but ultimately, the jury saw through any justifications. The judge described the killings as unimaginable and beyond comprehension. He was sentenced to life imprisonment for 7 counts of murder. Additionally, he was given 10 years for the killing of an unborn child and another 7 years for attempted murder. But even behind bars, the horror of what he had done did not fade. The parole board repeatedly denied his bids for release, citing his continued struggles with drug abuse. In 2008, the board noted that despite presenting himself as a reformed man in previous hearings, Radama had relapsed into cannabis use, blaming his actions on a dark day in his past. But if you think he had given up, think again. Year after year, Raymond Wayne Radama has stood before the parole board pleading for his release. He insists that he has changed, that he has grown, that he is no longer the man he was when he committed those horrific crimes in June of the year 1992. Yet each time, the board has denied his requests, stating the same concerns: his psychological state, his risk to society, and his lack of true remorse. It has now been more than 30 years since Radama was sentenced, and despite numerous parole hearings, the board remains unconvinced that he is fit to re-enter the world outside prison walls. Radama has been denied parole not just once or twice, but a total of 14 times. His repeated attempts to gain freedom have been met with the same result, and each rejection only adds to his frustration. His lawyer, Roger Eagles, has now taken a different approach, claiming that there is potential bias in the parole process. Eagles argues that one of the parole board members, Professor Philip Brynd, had previously prepared psychological reports on Radama in the year 1992, and his involvement in the current parole decisions could create an unfair assessment. Eagles insists that Brynd's prior contact with Radama, spanning back to the time of his original sentencing, raises questions about impartiality. He points out that Brynd is the only person on the board who has had extensive personal interaction with Radama, and this could lead to preconceived judgments rather than an objective evaluation of Radama's progress over the past 3 decades. The legal challenge does not stop there. Eagles has also argued that Radama's repeated parole denials themselves are evidence of his claims that despite Radama undergoing rehabilitation programs and counseling, The board has never granted him even a single opportunity for conditional release, raising concerns about whether he is being treated unfairly compared to other prisoners with similar convictions. However, the parole board has maintained its stance, insisting that every hearing is based on up-to-date psychological evaluations and risk assessments rather than relying on reports from the past. They argue that Radima's continued imprisonment is not the result of bias, but rather the outcome of his failure to meet the necessary criteria for release. Justice Lisa Preston, who is currently reviewing the case, has questioned why Radima himself did not object to Brian's presence on the board. Eagles responded by saying that it was not Radima's responsibility to point out the issue, as he lacks the legal expertise and education to fully understand the implications of Brian's involvement. Eagles further stated that Radima has significant academic difficulties due to his background, and that it should have been the responsibility of the chairperson to raise the matter. He insists that the failure to do so places an unfair burden on Radima and undermines the fairness of the parole process. Another point of contention in Radima's case is the way his parole hearings have been conducted. Eagles has argued that previous hearings have gone off track, with the board focusing too much on questioning Radima about his motivations for the crimes and the impact on his victims. He claims that the discussions have shifted from evaluating whether Radima is fit for release to revisiting his past, which should not be the central focus of the hearings. Eagles contends that while it is understandable for the board to consider the severity of Radima's crimes, parole decisions should be based on his rehabilitation and risk factors in the present rather than continuously re-examining the past. In the year 2021, it was revealed that Radima had begun a relationship with a woman who had suffered childhood trauma. The board expressed concerns about this relationship, fearing that it could be a trigger for another violent episode. Given Radima's history and the emotional volatility that played a role in his past actions, the board was deeply troubled by this revelation. They questioned whether Radima was capable of forming healthy relationships, or if this new connection was a sign of unresolved psychological issues. Despite attending nearly 100 sessions with a psychologist, board members still believed Radima lacked insight into his crimes, which made them skeptical of his ability to maintain a stable and responsible relationship outside of prison. The concern was not just about Radima himself, but also about the potential harm that could come to his partner if he were released without proper safeguards in place. During one of his parole hearings, Radima made a statement that only reinforced the board's concerns. He claimed that he had loved his children, and at the time, believed he was putting them in a better place by taking their lives. This statement sent chills down the spines of the parole board members, as it suggested that Radima still harbored a distorted sense of justification for his actions. Rather than fully accepting the gravity of his crimes, his words implied that he had once rationalized them as an act of mercy. The board saw this as a major red flag, an indication that Radima had not yet reached the level of self-awareness and accountability required for parole consideration. Despite these concerns, reports from inside the prison indicate that Radima has generally maintained good behavior. He has been described as respectful within the prison environment, and there have been positive reports about his work while incarcerated. Additionally, Corrections has stated that there is no further need for additional rehabilitation programs, as Radima has already completed the necessary courses. However, even with these positive notes, the parole board has remained firm in its decision to keep him behind bars, stating that good behavior in a controlled environment does not necessarily translate to safe behavior in the outside world. In his most recent parole hearing in the year 2024, Radima made a significant admission. For the first time in over 3 decades, he acknowledged that the killings were intentional. This directly contradicted his previous claims that the murders were not premeditated. While this confession marked a departure from his earlier statements, it still failed to provide clarity on the most crucial question. Why? Despite finally admitting his intent, Radima refused to explain his motives, leaving the victims' families and the parole board unsettled. During the hearing, he expressed deep regret, stating, "I was a very selfish man for what I did. All I can say is that I really regret full-heartedly the decision that I made in order to kill all those many children and adults. I hate myself for what I've done." However, the parole board remained skeptical. They pointed out that his changing narrative over the years only raised further concerns about his credibility. Given his history of inconsistent explanations, the board questioned whether this newfound admission was genuine or simply another attempt to manipulate the system in his favor. The victims' families continued to oppose his release, maintaining that Radama has never fully explained his actions or shown true remorse. To them, his admissions mean little without an honest, clear acknowledgement of why he did what he did. Many still believe that Radama poses a danger to society and should never be granted parole. In response to these concerns, the board recommended that Radama be transferred to a special treatment unit for violent offenders. However, he resisted the move, arguing that it would be a step backward in his rehabilitation rather than a constructive measure. Despite his efforts, the parole board once again denied Radama's release. The ruling made it clear that while his latest statement represented a shift, it was not enough to justify granting him freedom. The board emphasized that public safety remained their top priority and that Radama's risk factors had not diminished to a satisfactory level. For now, Raymond Wayne Radama remains in prison. His next parole eligibility will come in the year 2025. Whether he will finally succeed in persuading the board remains uncertain. However, given his long history of denied applications, changing statements, and ongoing concerns from the victims' families, his path to release remains as difficult as ever. But what do you think about this case? Do you believe Raymond Radama should be released, or do his actions and shifting statements prove that he is still a danger to society? Should the parole board continue denying his requests, or do you think he has shown enough remorse to deserve a second chance? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective on this case. And before anything else, I want to give a special shout out to Isabel Enzid for the recommendation to cover this case. Case 8. On the night of December 12, 2011, Brittany Eldridge was just 2 weeks away from meeting her baby boy, Ezekiel. She had spent months preparing for motherhood, filled with excitement and hope. But by the next morning, something was terribly wrong. When Brittany didn't show up for work, concerns spread quickly. She was always reliable, never the type to just disappear. Calls went straight to voicemail. Then her mother, Robin, decided to check on her at home, not knowing she was about to walk into a nightmare. The front door was unlocked, the apartment was a mess, and what she found inside would change everything. Who would do something like this to a woman about to start a new chapter in her life? And why, after all these years, does her case remain unsolved? Brittany Caroline Eldridge came into the world on January 13, 1986, born to Robin and Jeff. She grew up in Knoxville, Tennessee, alongside her brother Jeffrey. From an early age, Brittany was known for her warm heart and infectious kindness. She had a way of making everyone feel special, radiating positivity wherever she went. Her family meant everything to her. According to those closest to her, Brittany had a deeply romantic soul, always dreaming of love and connection. Her brother considered her his best friend, and she had a unique ability to connect with people of all backgrounds. She loved cheerleading and sports, but also embraced her feminine side, an easygoing, sociable person who could make friends anywhere. More than anything, Brittany longed to find true love. She envisioned herself settling down young and building a future with someone who truly cared for her. That dream seemed to come true when, at 22, she met Terry Eldridge, a 39-year-old man who, despite their age difference, seemed like the perfect match. Brittany's outgoing and lively nature balanced Terry's more private and composed personality. Their differences complemented each other, and within a few months of dating, they tied the knot. However, as time passed, cracks began to show in their marriage. The biggest issue was their stance on children. Brittany had always wanted to be a mother. It was her ultimate dream. But Terry had no desire to have kids, and while Brittany initially accepted this, it became a growing source of frustration. Complicating matters, their work schedules kept them apart. Brittany worked at Vanderbilt Mortgage and Finance, while Terry's job as a truck driver meant long, unpredictable hours. Though their marriage wasn't filled with dramatic fights, their connection gradually faded. 3 years into their marriage, as Brittany struggled with the growing emotional distance, someone new entered her life. Norman Clark, a coworker at Vanderbilt Mortgage and Finance. Norman, in his mid-20s, had once aspired to play professional basketball, but ended up in the corporate world. Charismatic and easygoing, he and Brittany bonded quickly. They started at the company on the same day, and as Norman navigated his new role, Brittany often helped him find his footing. At first, their relationship was entirely professional, but as months passed, their conversations became deeper and their connection undeniable. Brittany, feeling unfulfilled in her marriage, found herself drawn to Norman. Before long, their friendship turned into something more, something they had to keep a secret. For months, Brittany and Norman carried on their relationship discreetly, meeting outside of work and keeping their communication private. But secrets rarely stay hidden forever. In February 2011, Terry discovered Brittany's affair. The betrayal devastated him, and after much heartache, he and Brittany decided to separate. She moved into her own place at the Cross Creek apartment complex on Western Avenue in Knoxville, while Terry initiated divorce proceedings. Now free from her marriage, Brittany and Norman became more open about their relationship. Their bond deepened, and life seemed to be taking a new direction, until another unexpected twist emerged. Brittany had news that would change everything. She was pregnant with Norman's child. But there was a complication. Brittany and Norman never had an exclusive relationship. In fact, Norman himself described what they had as a casual arrangement, more of a friends-with-benefits situation than a committed partnership. What Brittany didn't know, however, was just how many women Norman had been seeing at the same time. During an interview, Norman admitted to being involved with at least 15 to 20 different women while he was with Brittany. To make matters worse, none of them were aware of each other. One of these women had even given birth to his child, meaning Brittany wasn't the only one carrying his baby. It was an unsettling revelation, though perhaps not entirely surprising. After all, a relationship that starts as an affair doesn't exactly begin with trust and honesty. But despite his questionable behavior, Norman had a soft spot when it came to fatherhood. When Brittany told him she was pregnant, his reaction was unexpected. He was thrilled. While Norman wasn't the type of man to settle down with one woman, he took pride in being an involved father. He had already been financially supporting his other child, and seemed to take his role as a dad seriously. With Brittany's pregnancy, he was ready to step up again, just not as a lifelong partner. As Brittany's pregnancy progressed, she finalized her divorce from Terry and continued seeing Norman, though their relationship remained complicated. The two attended prenatal appointments together and even picked out a name for their baby boy, Ezekiel. For the most part, Brittany's life seemed to be falling into place. She was about to become a mother, the one thing she had always dreamed of. But just weeks before reaching that milestone, everything took a devastating and tragic turn. Brittany was due to give birth in December 2011, and up until then, she had continued working at Vanderbilt Mortgage and Finance. But on December 13th, just 2 weeks before her due date, she didn't show up for work. Her absence raised immediate concern. Brittany was known for being responsible, and if she had planned to take the day off, she would have let someone know. Given how far along she was in her pregnancy, her coworkers feared the worst, that something might have gone wrong. One of Brittany's closest friends and colleagues, Andrea, was also one of the few people who knew about her relationship with Norman. Sensing that something wasn't right, Andrea went to Norman and suggested that he contact Brittany's mother, Robin, to check in on her. Norman called Robin right away, asking if she had seen or heard from Brittany. The question sent a wave of dread through Robin. Something fell off. Without hesitation, she drove straight to her daughter's apartment at the Cross Creek complex on Western Avenue. When she arrived, an eerie feeling settled over her. As she reached for the door handle, she realized it was unlocked. The door creaked open effortlessly, sending a chill down her spine. Stepping inside, she was met with a disturbing sight. The living room was in complete disarray. Brittany's television had been ripped from the wall and lay shattered on the floor. Her purse had been dumped out, 2 laptops were scattered nearby, and the entire scene screamed of chaos. Robin's stomach tightened. She knew something terrible had happened. Before going any further, she did the only thing she could think of. She called 911. As she spoke to the dispatcher, she was instructed to check the apartment for Brittany and see if she was inside. Robin hesitated, but did as she was told, making her way down the hallway toward the bedroom. That's when she heard it, the faint sound of running water. Her breath hitched as she followed the noise, her heart pounding harder with every step. When she reached the bathroom, she slowly pushed the door open, and what she saw would haunt her forever. Brittany was there, lying lifeless in the overflowing bathtub. The sight was too much to bear. Overcome with horror, Robin ran from the apartment, unable to process what she had just seen. Moments later, the police arrived, securing the scene and confirming what Robin already knew. Her daughter was gone. Brittany had been strangled. Her injuries left no doubt that she had fought for her life. But the pain didn't end there. In the cruelest twist of fate, baby Ezekiel hadn't survived either. Authorities immediately launched an investigation. They removed Brittany's body for an autopsy, hoping forensic evidence would point to her killer. Meanwhile, her friends and family reeled from the devastating news, struggling to understand how something so horrific could have happened. At first glance, the theory of a robbery gone wrong seemed plausible. Brittany's apartment complex had recently experienced a string of break-ins, making it easy to assume that she had been the latest victim. But as investigators dug deeper, they began to question whether this was really the case. If Brittany had been targeted by a burglar, why was nothing of value taken? Her debit card, which had a note with the PIN number attached, remained untouched. Other valuables, including her laptops, were still in the apartment. It didn't make sense. The police were left puzzled. Violent home invasions typically don't end with the victim's life being taken while leaving behind all the valuables. The more they examined the scene, the more it seemed like someone had staged the break-in. It appeared as though whoever was responsible had wanted it to look like a robbery, but the details didn't line up. There was no sign of forced entry, which meant Brittany had likely let her attacker in willingly, or that the person already knew how to access her home. With this in mind, the police quickly shifted their focus. This was no burglary. This was a homicide. When investigators informed Norman about Brittany's death, his reaction was caught on a dashcam. The moment he heard the news, he broke down in tears, visibly distraught, repeating, "What happened? That's my family. That's my baby." His emotional response was raw, but the police weren't ready to rule him out just yet. Given the brutal nature of the crime, investigators strongly believed that Brittany had been attacked by someone she knew, someone with motive, and Norman, her former lover and the father of her unborn child, was at the top of their list. The questioning began immediately. Norman answered every question without hesitation, even voluntarily providing his DNA without a lawyer present. Then, Brittany's autopsy results came in, adding a new layer to the investigation. It was determined that Brittany had been deceased for about 12 hours before she was found. More importantly, forensic analysis revealed 2 unidentified male DNA samples on her body. The police quickly compared one of them to Norman's, expecting a match, but to their surprise, it wasn't his. Now, investigators were left with more questions than answers. If Norman wasn't the source of the DNA, who was? They turned to Brittany's family for more insight into her relationship with Norman. According to her mother, Robin, Norman had always been affectionate toward Brittany. However, tensions had been building ever since Brittany announced her pregnancy. At the time, Norman had been struggling financially. He was drowning in debt, facing pressure from collectors, and even living in his parents' basement. The police couldn't ignore the possibility that the financial burden of another child had pushed him over the edge. But if Norman was responsible, how had he done it? Investigators needed to establish his whereabouts on the night of December 12th, the last time Brittany was seen alive. Text messages between the two showed that they had planned to meet at her apartment that evening to discuss their future and the baby. When questioned, Norman insisted he never made it. Instead, he claimed to have spent the night with another woman, Leanne Hahn. Leanne confirmed that she had heard Norman arriving at her home around 10:30 p.m. that night. However, phone records told a slightly different story. Norman's phone had been traced to the area near Brittany's apartment that evening. Then, at some point after 9 p.m., he turned his phone off. This raised red flags for investigators. Why would he suddenly go off the grid? And why was he near Brittany's apartment when he claimed he never went there? At the same time, police also investigated Brittany's ex-husband, Terry, but he was quickly ruled out. He had been out of town during the time of the crime, and his DNA didn't match the unknown samples found at the scene. Despite having no physical evidence directly linking Norman to the crime, police strongly believed he was involved. The motive was there. His phone records placed him at the scene. There was no forced entry, suggesting Brittany had let her attacker in willingly. But the presence of 2 unknown DNA samples complicated the case. Still, authorities moved forward. With their suspicions locked in on Norman, they arrested him and charged him with 2 counts of first-degree murder, one for Brittany and one for baby Ezekiel. Norman, however, pleaded not guilty. As his trial approached, it became clear that this would be no straightforward case. In fact, there wouldn't be just one trial, but 2. The first trial, held in August 2015, nearly 4 years after Brittany's death, was intense. The prosecution argued that Norman was overwhelmed with financial stress and saw Brittany's pregnancy as yet another burden. They believed that, on December 12th, he had followed through on their planned meeting, attacked Brittany in her bathroom, and staged the scene to look like a robbery. The evidence seemed to support their claims. Norman had a clear motive. His phone records contradicted his alibi. There was no sign of forced entry. further suggesting that Brittany had willingly let her attacker inside. But one major issue remained: the DNA. If Norman had committed the crime, whose DNA had been found on Brittany? Prosecutors theorized that Norman hadn't acted alone. They suggested he may have had an accomplice, someone who had helped him carry out the attack. But without concrete proof, this remained speculation. Then, the trial took another unexpected turn. A key piece of evidence was introduced: Brittany's diary. Among Brittany's personal belongings, investigators discovered a diary, one that gave them an unfiltered look into her thoughts and emotions leading up to her death. The entries painted a heartbreaking picture of her relationship with Norman. She wrote things like, "I deserve better. He never asks how I'm doing or how the baby is doing. I miss the person he used to be. Why does he seem so secretive sometimes? I do have to wonder if he's seeing someone else or multiple people. I wish he cared about me like he used to." These words revealed a growing sense of disappointment and isolation. It was clear that Norman had changed after learning about her pregnancy. But did this mean he had a motive to harm her? The defense argued otherwise. They maintained that Brittany had been the victim of a burglary gone wrong, pointing to the unknown male DNA found on her body. Their biggest argument, however, was the complete absence of Norman's DNA at the crime scene. If Norman had physically attacked Brittany, they argued, traces of his DNA should have been left behind. Given the apparent struggle that had taken place, they found it unlikely that he could have committed the crime, cleaned himself up, disposed of any incriminating evidence, staged the scene, and left the apartment without leaving behind a single shred of forensic proof. The defense also pushed back against the idea that Brittany's diary indicated any real danger. While her words expressed frustration and sadness, they weren't evidence of physical violence or threats. To them, the prosecution was grasping at straws. After hearing testimony from Brittany's loved ones and other witnesses, the jury deliberated for nearly a full day before reaching a decision. But when the verdict was announced, it wasn't the closure Brittany's family had hoped for. It was a hung jury. 11 jurors believed Norman was not guilty, while one remained unconvinced. Without a unanimous decision, the case wasn't resolved, and the prosecution immediately decided to take Norman to trial again. For Brittany's family, it was another crushing setback. They had spent years searching for justice, and after all the effort, they were still left without answers. The second trial took place in 2017, with the same evidence, the same proceedings, and the same emotional weight. The only difference was that Norman had a new defense attorney. His first lawyer, Greg Isaacs, was replaced by Kit Rogers, a former Knox County prosecutor. This time, the jury deliberated for nearly 5 days before reaching a decision, and once again, they failed to agree. But there was a shift. In this trial, 11 jurors voted for a guilty verdict, while only one held out in Norman's favor. It was the opposite of the first trial, but since the decision wasn't unanimous, it was another mistrial. After 2 failed attempts to convict Norman, the prosecution faced a difficult choice. Could they try him again? Would it lead to a different outcome? In January 2018, the Knox County District Attorney General made the final call not to pursue a third trial, and just like that, Norman Clark walked free. Brittany's case remains open, but without new evidence, the chances of a retrial are slim. If stronger proof ever emerges, Norman could face charges again. But for now, he remains a free man. On December 21, 2011, Brittany and baby Ezekiel were laid to rest in the same church Brittany had attended since childhood. It was a day filled with sorrow as family and friends gathered to say goodbye to a young woman whose greatest dream was to be a mother, one that was cruelly stolen from her. The Knoxville community stood by Brittany's family, offering their support, but no amount of kindness could undo the devastation they had suffered. Years have passed, but the wounds remain open. To this day, no one has been held accountable for what happened to Brittany and her unborn son. Was Norman responsible and simply got away with it? Or is the real perpetrator still out there, their secret buried with time? Brittany's family continues to wait for answers, for justice, for closure.